charmed her. She felt safe. She felt secure.
Stacy Peterson was last seen by her husband, Drew Peterson, a Bolingbrook police officer.
There's no signs of any foul play, so that's why we're handling it as a missing persons investigation.
Drew said Stacy left me. She left with another guy. She took money, she took her bikinis, and she took off.
I knew Drew had done something awful to Stacy.
Stacy had said, if anything happens to me, Drew did it.
He's guilty. Come forward and tell the truth. Tell me what you did to my sister.
Stacy Peterson wasn't Drew Peterson's only wife. She was his fourth wife.
His third wife died, and now his fourth wife is missing. You can't tell me that you don't think something's going on here. Drew would reel these women in with the promises and with the honeymoon stage. When that honeymoon stage was over, it's time to go on to someone else.
Drew Peterson thought he was untouchable. He can get away with domestic violence and murder.
I don't know how he got away with it. How could the police have ignored this?
Nothing in his record, to my knowledge, indicates any type of domestic violence.
I should have known that Drew Peterson had domestics. Didn't know it. So I've shut my mouth for 10 years and said nothing because, in retrospect, it's my fault for not digging deeper.
It's October 28, 2007. Bolingbrook, Illinois. A small suburb about 30 miles outside of Chicago. Safe place to live. Everybody knows each other. Neighbors watch out for each other. I'm Steph Watts, and I reported on the Stacy Peterson disappearance. The local police get a call from a Cassandra Kales. She reports her sister, Stacy Peterson, missing. What makes this call unusual is the person missing, Stacy Peterson, is married to Bolingbrook Police Sergeant Drew Peterson.
Stacy's sister, Cassandra, gives police an account of the last time she saw Stacy.
Saturday night, the night before, Stacy disappeared. I went over for dinner at Stacy's house. I'm Cassandra Kales, Stacy Peterson's sister. When I was leaving, she just said, if anything were to happen to her, Drew did it. I gave her a hug, and I told her everything will be okay. And that was the last time I saw her.
The next morning, Stacy fails to show up to meet Cassandra at her friend's house.
Sunday, I called Stacy. If I call, she usually answers. And Stacy's phone was either on and ringing or it was off. It was kind of doing that all day. So I called Drew. He just answers the phone and starts running his mouth. Your sister left me. She took the car. She took everything. She's gone. She left.
Why would a seemingly happily married mother of 4 just pick up and leave her entire family behind?
Drew called Paul to tell him, hey, Stacy's missing. She took money, she took her bikinis, and she took off. I'm Norma Peterson. I'm married to Drew's brother, Paul. I'm Stacy Peterson's sister-in-law.
I didn't believe anything. I knew she would never leave her kids.
For Stacy, family was everything.
As Sunday wears on, Cassandra's concerns turn into desperation.
By this time, it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I went to Bolingbrook Police Department. Finally, I get somebody, and they're like, oh, you're going to come back? And I said, no, you don't understand. And I started talking, and finally somebody came, brought me in the back. I told him everything, and he said that they would look into it. Stacy was 16. She was working at the hotel when she met Drew. It was a secret. In the beginning, it was, I gotta go meet Drew. And she would ditch me.
This man was so much older than her. She said he was the father she never had. I'm Candace Aiken, and I'm Stacy Peterson's aunt. He took her a lot of places. He bought her a lot of jewelry. I think Drew basically charmed her. She felt safe. She felt secure.
The other badge, he could protect her. He just gave him more power to make her fall for him. I think Stacy was brainwashed by Drew.
Stacy loved family. She had adopted Drew's 2 children, and she had had 2 children with Drew.
That was Stacy's whole world, was taking care of those children. She didn't leave her children willingly.
It's Monday, October 29th, 2007. Day one of the investigation of Stacy Peterson's disappearance.
My deputy chief walked into my office and said, Ray, Stacy Peterson is missing. And I didn't connect the dots right away because I was like, who? And he says, Drew's wife. My name is Ray McGurry. I am the former police chief for the village of Bolingbrook. Well, right away, I'm like, okay, well, what are the issues here? What do you mean she's disappeared? Information was coming back to me that Drew had said that she had met somebody else. She didn't want to be a mother anymore and had just ran away and was going to be off the grid. I said, okay, maybe that very well is true. I mean, I don't know what I don't know yet. We were initially doing some quick background investigation. We were working the neighborhood, working the neighbors, trying to get some background information. Okay, so when was the last time you talked to Stacy? Our mindset was that right now, we don't have a homicide. We have a missing persons, and if we find her, well, then this is all a moot point. Okay, if she's alive and well, no harm, no foul.
The first person police usually look at in a missing persons case is the spouse. But this time, the spouse happens to be one of their own, who claims his wife left for another man.
Drew liked the whole profile of being a cop. Drew liked being able to tell the stories about it. He liked to be able to discuss the things that he had done that day.
Drew Peterson's badge gave him credibility and authority, and it really defined who he was. It was a big part of his life. However, rumors swirled of abuse of his badge. There was perhaps two sides to Drew Peterson.
It was too early in the investigation to form 100% opinion. This is the guy, and focus everything on that. I mean, you have to go into these things with an open mind.
Because he's a cop, I believe they were protecting their own kind, the blue wall, or the badge, or whatever you want to call it.
Cassandra is growing desperate.
I went home, and I was like, what do I do? What do I do?
Cassandra, I talked to her, and she was telling me that she had went to the police. She didn't know who to trust on the force. She really did not know where to turn.
I didn't know what I was doing. I just Googled, call the news station. We called CBS. And he's like, they're coming over. I said, okay, when? Right now.
My main goal right now is to bring her home.
And then after that, it was boom. My phone was blowing up. Everybody wanted to talk.
Instantly, news reports on Stacy Peterson's disappearance covered the airwaves.
Cassandra lit this thing quick. Within 24 hours, there was every national network, every local network, and they were in the lobby with a camera crew and wanted a statement from me immediately.
Stacy was reported missing, but I wanted to consult with the family. They have my guarantee of 100% cooperation.
I hardly ever watch the news, but when you're living it, you have to. And I was proud because I was the one that went to the media. Who else would have brought around all the attention?
There's no signs of any foul play, so that's why we're handling it as a missing persons investigation.
In the media, we're getting two different stories. We've got Stacy's family saying she's missing, we don't know where she is, and we've got her husband, Bolingbrook police officer Drew Peterson, saying she ran away, she left me. What we had to figure out is which one of those two stories was the correct story.
I knew right away in my heart that Stacy was gone. I knew it in my gut that Drew had done something awful to Stacy. She was gone and I would never see her again.
So I got a call from my dad that Stacy left him. She took some money and the titles to the house and left. I didn't think it was unusual that she would have left because, well, she was 30 years younger. I'm Steve Peterson, and I'm Drew Peterson's son. Growing up, I was definitely close to my father. He was always there for us. He was a great father. We never went without. You know, you're told something, and my dad says she left. There's no, reason not to believe your dad, so I didn't question it.
Early on, Drew was fairly welcoming. I remember we walked in the front door. He comes down the stairs and has a pill bottle in his hands, puts it on the desk, slides it across, and says, "Look at me. I'm 30 years older than her. She was young. She was beautiful. She was taking medication. He was hinting that she was troubled and perhaps on drugs. He said it in a way that he was almost embarrassed that we were there. An older guy and his gorgeous young wife had left, and he didn't really warrant all this attention. I absolutely believed his story.
While Drew Peterson is busy charming the media, Stacy's family and friends seem convinced of something far darker.
Just remember seeing her on the news and thinking, oh my God, this is not going to end well.
She just said, you know, if anything happens to me, Drew did it.
We left Drew Peterson's house and walked next door to neighbor Sharon Bukowski's house. Lots of people in there, concerned neighbors, concerned friends, members of the media. And what I found out was interesting and also alarming. Stacy Peterson wasn't Drew Peterson's only wife. As a matter of fact, she was his fourth wife. His third wife, Kathleen Savio, had died accidentally in the bathtub.
As soon as Stacy went missing, somebody mentioned, well, you know, his third wife died under unusual circumstances. So I asked for the file.
His third wife is gone, and now his fourth wife is missing. You can't tell me that you don't think something's going on here.
Coming up, police are inundated with leads that all seem to point in one shocking direction.
He put a knife at her throat, and he said, I can kill you now. Then they would know it was me. It's not just the average guy. It's a cop. You're supposed to be able to trust them.
There's accidental deaths, there's murder, there's car crashes, there's disappearances. This is an awful lot. Bad things happen around Drew Peterson.
And later, despite growing pressure, Drew Peterson continues to calmly maintain his innocence.
We're seeing his odd behavior in the media.
What would you say to Stacy, your fourth wife? Come home. Tell people where you are.
It's a game at this point, and the walls are slowly closing in, but Drew Peterson's sticking to his story. Stacy Peterson left.
October 30th, 2007. 23-year-old Stacy Peterson is gone. Her husband, Bolingbrook Police Sergeant Drew Peterson, says that Stacy left him for another man. But Stacy's sister, Cassandra Kales, refuses to believe Stacy abandoned her family.
My gut told me that something happened to my sister.
The reaction that Cassandra gave me, she was absolutely convinced that she was going to turn up dead.
We asked Cassandra if she thinks her sister is still alive.
No.
Cassandra absolutely hated everything about the Bolingbrook Police Department. As the person that was married to her sister and was a sergeant, I was his boss. In her mind, Cassandra made a snap judgment that A, she was murdered, and B, that Drew did it.
Drew killed Stacy.
He's guilty. Just come forward and tell the truth. Tell me what you did to my sister.
By day 3 of the investigation, assisted by the media attention that Cassandra had created, community volunteers join in the search for Stacy.
Friends, family, and strangers took the search for Stacy Peterson into their own hands this morning.
But Stacy's husband, Drew, is not part of any search.
Have you ever taken part in the search for Stacy?
Well, there's two things. One thing, it's like I'm such a media sensation right now. If I go out and search, I think the search would be hampered by, number one, all the media attention I'd be getting. And two, why would I look for somebody who I don't believe is missing? She's just gone. She's where she wants to be.
Whatever your dad tells you is the truth. You know, okay, she'll be back. Let's wait it out, see what happens.
People at Bolingbrook were phenomenal. I mean, just phenomenal. They just came out in droves wanting to help.
I would go and be there to support them at the church, the command center, and then go out and set off to search.
At the time, searches were being launched from the church that I worked at. It was kind of a control and command station. I'm Neil Shorey. I'm the pastor of Naperville Christian Church. I was Stacy and Drew Peterson's pastor. We'd have search leaders, and we'd go to various places throughout Bolingbrook to search. It felt purposeful, but it also felt incredibly stressful. This is a missing woman, and it's our job to find her.
While the search continues, the state's attorney works a different lead. one that will yield disturbing results.
As soon as Stacy went missing, somebody mentioned, well, you know, his third wife, Kathleen Savio, died under unusual circumstances. She drowned in the bathtub, but she was never in any amount of water in that bathtub. So I asked for the file. I'm Jim Glasgow, State's Attorney in Will County, Illinois.
When Stacy Peterson goes missing, James Glasgow requests a re-examination of the death and autopsy of Kathleen Savio, Drew Peterson's third wife.
I had a meeting with the coroner and Dr. Mitchell, who had done the autopsy. We went through all the different facts. When I saw the photograph of her in the bathtub, I immediately knew this wasn't an accident. There was no blood above her body. She supposedly smashed her head against the wall, knocking herself out so she drowned, and there's no blood above her body. This is the problem.
Is it possible that there was a cover-up in the investigation of Kathleen Savio's death?
When I looked at the autopsy report, it rocked me out of my chair. It made me look at this in a whole different light. You didn't have to be somebody with 25 years police experience to understand that this was by no means, from what was written in this report, an accident.
The media and law enforcement, we believed that it was very possible that Kathleen Savio was murdered, that it was not an accident.
I felt there was definitely cause to do the second autopsy. And there hadn't been an exhumation in a criminal case in Will County for 40 years.
Up until now, Drew Peterson has not been a suspect in the disappearance of his wife, Stacy. But with this new discovery, he is someone the eyes of the law cannot look past.
Now, we had two separate cases that were running across each other. My office is working with the police in their investigation into the disappearance of Stacy. And at the same time, we're looking at the questionable death of his prior wife, Kathleen Savio. So you're dealing with a policeman and potentially two murdered wives.
In speaking with Kathleen Savio's family members, everyone said Kathleen Savio was potentially Drew Peterson's first victim.
Journalists and law enforcement start looking for possible clues by taking a deep dive into Drew's past.
Drew Peterson grew up in suburban Chicago. He went to Willowbrook High School. Drew served in the Army. He was a military policeman. I'm Joe Hosey. I'm a reporter. I covered the Drew Peterson case. He married his high school sweetheart, Carol Brown. Drew and Carol had two children, Steve and Eric. After he got out of the Army, he and his wife and children lived in Bolingbrook, where he was a Bolingbrook police officer.
He joined the Bolingbrook Police in 1977. 2 years later, he was named Police Officer of the Year.
Growing up, we got to ride along with my dad, or he'd let us run radar, decide whether we were going to have tickets or not. You know, fun stuff that any kid would love to do. The only time you have a police officer father, you know, he's your hero. You know, he's everything.
When I spoke with Carol, she said their marriage was an average, normal marriage. That Drew was a great father. There was never any acts of violence, according to Carol.
Carol, my mom, she's never once told me that he's ever laid a hand on her or anything like that.
Are Drew and Carol really so happily married? Or is there more to what meets the eye?
He quickly moved into the narcotics division, headlining the war on drugs in that area.
Drew was part of a special multi-jurisdictional undercover narcotics team. He grew his hair long, he had facial hair to look the part. He loved to talk about how he could fool people into thinking he was a drug dealer or a drug buyer.
He had to be a really good liar for people to believe who he was. I'm sure it affected him.
Being an undercover police officer, you can do all of the things the criminal does, but you know that you don't have to pay the price. I'm Dr. Jeff Gardier. I'm a clinical psychologist. Most law enforcement understand the roles and can go back to regular existence, but there is a minority of individuals who lose themselves in that role.
Is it possible that Drew is taking advantage of his position of power?
For him, it's more of a thrill. Look, I get to go be undercover and go hang out with all these bad guys, and they look at me like I'm one of them. And I have a girlfriend over here that I have to keep up with. And then he would leave that life to come home to Carol. Drew was able to live two lives simultaneously.
You know, the old joke they said was, They'd have to lie to their girlfriends to get home to their wives. You know, he was good at it.
After 10 years of marriage, Carol realizes Drew is no longer the man she married and wants a divorce.
His infidelity. That's what causes his first divorce. Drew found someone else.
I met Drew. I was working part-time at a gas station, and somebody had run off without paying for gas, so we called the police, and he was the officer that showed up. I'm Kyle Morrison. I was engaged to Drew Peterson. I was very young. I was 20 years old. He was 27, divorced, had 2 small children. My family really liked him. He was a really nice guy, very charming. And he was a police officer in Bolingbrook. We were engaged probably within 4 months.
Kyle is impressed with the successful cop and father, but the relationship isn't working out for her, and she decides to call it quits.
It was suffocating and stifling. He didn't like me going out with my friends. Everything was a fight. When I broke up with him, Drew was heartbroken. He called my mother at work, and he was devastated. And at this time, he had already started a relationship with someone else. It's really crazy. He continued to harass me afterwards. I was going to work one day. Drew pulls up in a squad car with a woman officer. He gets out and he's smiling and it's all funny. And he says, "You're under arrest." And I said, "For what?" He said, "Because you have all these unpaid parking tickets." So literally put me in the police car. I was really scared and frightened. And the woman was in there, and I said, "Well, you know, I was engaged to him." And she was like, "Oh, no, I didn't know that." And you could tell once she knew who I was that this was inappropriate. I found out later he had been writing tickets for my car that I never got. So I did call the police. Unfortunately, because it was Bolingbrook, one of his friends came and said, "Well, you know, he's just upset. You don't really want to press charges." They ended up just dropping the whole thing. I think that is probably what makes this story scarier. It's not just the average guy. It's a cop. You're supposed to be able to trust them.
I love you too.
Yeah, how much?
From my heart.
After his marriage to Carol and his failed engagement to Kyle, Drew marries Vicki Connolly in 1982.
Vicki was very nice, easy person to get along with. She thought, here's this wonderful guy. He's going to take care of me. He's going to take care of my kid.
Drew got married a second time to Vicki Connolly, who he owned a bar with.
During the time he was married to Vicki, it was actually a good family time. I don't think there was anything we didn't celebrate. You know, Vicki was great to us.
Drew got with Vicki quickly after his relationship ended. They both had children from separate marriages, and he continued his work as a police officer.
His warnings to me about working undercover were that you would have to have a whole different life. Some of the stories my dad would tell me, he mentioned people pulling guns and putting them in his face and pulling the trigger, and it gets jammed, and how he should be dead, and just the stress of it all, I think, just weighed on him.
A darker side to Drew Peterson started to unravel during his marriage to Vicki. It's rumored that there was some illegal activity happening with Drew.
I know one person he had arrested telling me he shook him down. Drew wanted him to provide cocaine that Drew could turn around and sell. Drew was never charged with that. And who can say if there's any truth to it. But there was a pattern emerging of Drew allegedly abusing his authority, trying to intimidate them with his uniform and his badge. He actually got fired from the police department, and he was charged with a felony for official misconduct. He was conducting unauthorized investigations, investigating drug dealers without the knowledge of his supervisors. Who knows what he was really up to?
It took Drew and Vicki a couple of years and a lot of money to get that all straightened out, but at a later period of time, they reinstated him. I believe they even apologized to him for putting him through that.
Despite enduring this turbulent controversy together, Drew and Vicki's decade of marriage becomes troubled by something even more upsetting.
Vicki told me that she knew Drew was being unfaithful to her. and that she basically just wanted to get out of the marriage.
During the divorce, she told of Drew trying to hold on to all of his assets. He didn't want to give up anything.
When he talks to his family to tell them he was breaking up with Vicky, oh, well, she's a drug addict. She's spending too much time at the bar. It was always making that other person look like it was all their fault, that he had to make the decisions that Drew felt he needed to make.
One night, Drew arrives at the bar. He tells Vicky, why don't you take the night off? Vicky says, sure. She's driving home. Brakes fail. She can't stop the car.
Vicky's car is driven off the road.
And the mechanic said, somebody cut your brake lines. She couldn't prove Drew Peterson did it, but couldn't think of anyone else who would have done that. They didn't break, they were cut.
Vicky told me that she believed that Drew Peterson was the one who cut her brakes in an attempt to stop her from getting at his pension and getting at any of the bar money.
So she backed off on the pension, and then everything went smoothly on their divorce.
A few weeks later, Vicky wakes up in the middle of the night and Drew Peterson's standing over top of her in the dark, staring at her as she's sleeping.
He didn't say anything, and he just left. What did he tell her? I own you anytime I want.
Drew made it known to Vicky that there wasn't anywhere that she could go that he wasn't going to find her.
This is obviously a person who carries a chip on his shoulder. Now we're getting a developing picture of someone who has troubling relationships, someone who wants the world to kneel before them.
Drew would reel these women in with the promises and with the honeymoon stage. Now that honeymoon stage was over, now it's time to go on to someone else.
Kathleen was about to be 30 years old, and she wanted to settle down and wanted to have children. So her friend, she said to him, why don't we go on a blind date? And that's when she met Drew. I'm Sue Savio Doman. I'm Kathleen Savio's sister. She said he was very nice, very smart, he had a lot of money. She liked him.
She did fit the profile that he normally went after. Someone who was younger that he could prey on, someone who would look at him like a rescuer.
She said, he wants to marry me. It seems strange to me that she would get married that fast.
They were married fairly quick. We just lost our stepmother, Vicky. You know, now we're moving on to a new one. She's moving in within a couple months, and it seemed pretty quick to us, and we just kind of had to deal with it.
Her first child, everything was fine, and then after the second one, Drew would disappear a lot, sometimes not even come home.
How much do you love me, Daddy?
With all my heart.
But Drew got me first. Our third anniversary. 3 years, it seems like 30.
We knew that they were arguing. We didn't realize the extent of the fighting that was going on between those two.
One night, Kathy came home from the bar. She left early. My dad lost his mind. He did destroy the house. Glasses were shattered and tables were flipped. It sounded like a train was coming through the house.
There were issues with Kathleen Savio's that come to find out at the house where we were showing up several different times for different arguments. She was being painted as being nuts. Drew painted that picture. Drew, working for the Bolingbrook Police Department, could influence the outcome of whatever that call may be. Well, he's a sergeant with us. We know him. That's how that picture got painted. Well, that was wrong.
Bolingbrook police were called to the Peterson home a shocking total of 18 times during Drew and Kathleen's marriage.
Things really broke down with Drew and Kathleen when she received an anonymous letter from the police department, and their marriage fell apart.
The letter said that Drew Peterson was having an affair with a 16-year-old Stacy Chaos. Kathleen was in shock. She couldn't believe it. She didn't understand why he would go with someone so young, a child.
He should have been charged with a sex crime because he's a police officer in a person in a position of authority, and she's 16. and that's against the law in Illinois.
Drew was on the phone trying to convince me everything's fine. He said somebody was lying at the department and they sent her this phony letter. She grabbed the phone and she said, "I have it here and you're not getting it." I heard the phone fall and she said, he's hitting me. He threw her against the refrigerator. I could hear her. And I was like, oh my God. She got away. She went right to get an order of protection. Kathleen said the letter was true. Drew was having an affair. She was done with him.
I don't know how he got away with his relationship with Stacey Kells. He wasn't keeping it a secret. He brought her out with him to police officers, social events. People in the town government were aware of it. No one told him to stop it, and no one charged him with a crime.
Right when Stacey turned 17, she's got a house. Well, we bought a house. I believe he was trying to buy her love.
Drew came to Kathleen and said, how about we divorce and we just settle later on because Stacey's pregnant.
Kathy initially contacted me because she was divorcing Drew Peterson. I'm Harry Smith. I was Kathleen Savio's attorney. As an attorney listening to divorce clients, there is stories that are pretty standard. Hers was not. She had accusations, concerns, fears that were far outside the norm of what you would hear from a divorce client. Stacey would come to court with him. It was incendiary. I mean, it was crazy. What that added to the dynamic in the hallway between Kathy, Drew, and now Stacey being there as well.
Stacey told me that he was leaving Kathleen because she's crazy and abusive, and I didn't know what to say, but that's what Drew was feeding her.
Stacey said that Kathleen wanted all of Drew's money and Drew was scared about his retirement. Kathleen was pretty much like a nuisance in their lives.
Kathy was so convinced of the evilness that was her husband that it was hard to fathom. It's what makes this whole case so strange. She was telling the truth, and it was impossible to accept.
October 10th, 2003. Kathleen and Drew divorce, but they leave financial details to be resolved later.
It was a bifurcated divorce, which is extremely unusual. And they did it so that Drew could go ahead and marry his teenage girlfriend, Stacey, while the financials, which is what most divorce disagreements are predicated on, was still hanging out there.
It wasn't a big wedding. It was just this spot Stacey picked out, this beautiful little place in Bolingbrook.
Once again, despite getting exactly what he asked for, Drew Peterson goes on the attack immediately after his marriage to Stacey, 8 days after he and Kathleen divorce.
Drew got Kathleen's garage opened and he cut a hole going into the living room and he crawled through there. She was coming down the stairs with her laundry basket. She got scared. He told her to sit down and he put a knife at her throat and leaned her back. He was going to be telling her how it was going to be. And he said, I can kill you now. But if I killed you, there'd be too much blood. Then they would know it was me.
Now he's got this really beautiful woman. He says that he has moved on, but yet he has to be in control. He can't seem to get over anything that he views as some sort of a slight.
Divorce clients don't break into homes dressed in black clothes and hold K-bar knives to women's throats. That all doesn't feel possible. She took me to the state's attorney's office to tell them that he was going to kill her. She wanted people to know that he broke into her house and had threatened her with a knife if she didn't come into compliance in the divorce. It sure felt like it couldn't be possible. He's just not going to kill somebody. There's a divorce pending and he's a police officer.
But just days before the divorce trial to settle the financials begins, Harry Smith receives a shocking call.
We had a trial date set. My secretary called me and said that Kathleen was dead.
Coming up, what secrets are buried deep underground?
How did Kathleen Savio die days before she was heading to divorce court?
Everything we've believed up until this point could possibly be untrue.
And later, did police ignore vital signs in the case of Stacy Peterson's disappearance?
That's my frustration sitting here today. That's why I've shut my mouth for 10 years and said nothing, because in retrospect, I probably should have known that.
After Drew Peterson's fourth wife, Stacy, disappears in 2007, the state's attorney, Jim Glasgow, decides to look more closely at the earlier accidental death of Drew's third wife, Kathleen.
As soon as Stacy went missing, that same day, somebody mentioned, well, you know, his third wife died under unusual circumstances. So I asked for the file.
What he finds upon re-examination rocks the case wide open.
All I can tell you is that if any experienced prosecutor looked at that file, they'd say, this is not an accident.
Jim Glasgow looks deeper into the night Kathleen's body was found. Monday, March 1st, 2004. Drew arrived at Kathleen's to drop the kids off, but no one answered. He returned the following night to try again.
Drew said that he went to the house and she didn't answer. This was maybe about the second or third time he tried to get, knock on the door. So he went to the neighbor's house. He asked the neighbor, do you think that you can go in the house and see, because I can't go in there. If I go in there, Kathleen's going to call the police on me again.
Now here you've got a situation where any trained cop knows, holy cow, she could be in there, she could be dying, she could have died, all kinds of situations requiring professional assistance. Does he call the fire department? Does he call for police backup? No. Those would be the things that an innocent man would have done.
Drew called a locksmith and they went in the house. He stood outside on the bottom of the stairs. He let everybody go scatter. And the neighbor just was going upstairs and found her in the bathtub in a fetal position. The neighbor screamed.
Drew knows exactly where to run when he goes in the house, runs right upstairs, and then goes in the bathroom.
He took her pulse. He said, she's dead.
He's now putting his DNA in there, his fingerprints and his hair, in case that happens to show up. Now he's got an explanation for it. He's a 30-year policeman, been trained at every aspect of policing. He's the watch commander, the safety guy for the whole town.
Drew called the police. That was it. They just said, okay, well, looks like an accident to me. No investigation, no fingerprints, no questions, no nothing.
Investigation at the beginning, they dismissed it as an accident within a half hour of arriving at the scene. They didn't collect any evidence of any kind, no searching for DNA, fingerprints, fibers, hair. Thankfully, there were pictures taken that were helpful to us.
I don't know how he got away with it. I think it was sheer incompetence. How could the police have ignored this?
Glasgow finds, incredibly, that when Stacy is asked by police to give an alibi for Drew, she is not alone.
Subsequently, they had an interview with the police where he was allowed to sit next to Stacy and basically like a ventriloquist with his hand on her back, coaching her as she gave the story that he wanted her to give. He was always manipulating other people.
And not only did they allow Drew to sit next to her, they did that questioning in the basement of Drew Peterson's house. They didn't bring them to a police station, which is ridiculous.
The other issue was that that many people in the Bolingbrook Police Department may have known what Drew was up to. I absolutely 100% reject that. There may have been one or two officers that were friends of his off duty. I have no proof that they ever helped him do anything that involved Kathleen.
You look out for each other. Police officers, you look out for your fellow police officers, and you're like your family.
The day Kathleen died, Stacy called me at least 3 times that day, crying and hysterical. Stacy was very freaked out about Kathleen. She just kept calling me.
They found her in a dry bathtub. That seemed kind of sketchy to us. But what are you going to say?
I got a call from my dad, Kathy died, you need to come home. And, hit you like a ton of bricks. You just couldn't believe it. It was a total shock. But, okay, accidents happen.
The coroner's inquest. Whoever was directly involved, which they all knew Drew, so they were the ones that established what had happened and it was an accident.
We went to an inquest. I went on the stand and told them that Kathleen was murdered by Drew Peterson. She documented everything that was going on in that marriage, the abuse, and they came back and said it was an accident. The family had to accept that it was, but we never believed it. We knew that Drew was controlling the police department, and we couldn't do anything. We had to follow protocol.
How did Kathleen Savio die days before she was heading to divorce court? No one listens to the family that's saying, we've got documented reports of abuse. We've got Kathleen Savio saying, if anything happens to me, it was my ex-husband.
With suspicion swirling, Kathleen is buried quickly, and Drew brings a shocking end to his divorce settlement.
Her dying didn't end the divorce. The judge has jurisdiction on behalf of her estate to see what her estate is going to get from Drew Peterson. We never got there. Drew came to the probate court with a will that he said he had found, where Kathleen Savio allegedly made his uncle the executor of her estate. He fired me, and they then closed the divorce on behalf of the estate. It was laughable, but there's a lot of things that happened in this case that were like that.
Everybody told him that, wow, that was quite the break. You got real lucky, Dad. You don't gotta pay if this kind of worked out for him.
Kathleen, she's buried? The story's buried? Law enforcement had have done their job. If people had paid attention to what happened to Kathleen Savio, Stacey Peterson wouldn't be missing.
Drew was always playing by his own rules, but you go under the assumption that he's still working within the same rule book as everyone else. It's not until later on that you start to realize the extent that someone like Drew would go through to make sure that what he believed to be his, whether it be his children, his pension, his house, the extent that he would go to make sure that they stayed his.
Drew Peterson appears to have gotten everything he wanted, but old habits die hard, and Stacey begins to see a different side to the police sergeant she fell in love with.
Stacey didn't have any friends. She wasn't allowed to go out. I mean, even if Stacey wanted to go to dinner, girls' night out, Drew was like, can't I just go with? Can't I just go with? And we're like, no, it's girls' night out. I remember sitting at the restaurant, just chit-chatting, nothing, and she seen Drew circling the parking lot.
He cheated on every wife, so I'm sure, they always say the people who are the guiltiest are always the one who projected anybody else.
Drew Peterson was constantly accusing Stacey of cheating on him. It's a defense mechanism that's called projection. It's not me, it's you. The reality is, it's not really her, it's you, Drew.
I met Stacey at the end of 2005. After a service, she came up to me. She just wanted to talk about seemingly regular marriage issues. Who should do what in the marriage? If it was normal for her to go to the grocery store without him being jealous. It seemed like there might be more to the story, but she wouldn't necessarily just come out initially and talk about that.
Early in their marriage, Pastor Shorey counsels Stacey and Drew as the couple starts down a familiar path of jealousy and fights.
I met with Drew and Stacey at their house. Stacey, just in tons of tears, told me that when she got home, Drew came to the door and accused her of having affairs. And she said, "What are you talking about? I was seeing my sister." And I'll never forget this. She said, "He held me against the wall and he stripped all my clothes off and he smelled me to see if I'd been with another man." I looked over at Drew and he had absolutely zero response. He glanced at me, stood up, and he said, "Thanks for coming. I think I've had about enough today." I'd never felt afraid of Drew before that moment.
People who have a pathological personality, when the story is not written in the way they want it, they completely lose it. They become vengeful. You are on their radar. You will pay.
I knew she was in big trouble, and I didn't have any idea of what to do. I walked out the front door, and I remember turning back, and I looked, and Stacy was just standing there, just silently. I don't think she thought she was going to be around much longer.
State police are asking for more help in the search for Stacy Peterson. The 23-year-old mother of two has been missing now for nearly a month.
Stacy Peterson is reported missing at the end of October 2007, not by her husband Drew Peterson, but by her sister Cassandra, who is convinced something awful has happened to her.
My main goal right now is to bring her home.
We've got Stacy's family saying she's missing, we don't know where she is, and we've got her husband, Bolingbrook police officer Drew Peterson, saying she ran away, she left me.
What would you say to Stacy, your fourth wife? Come home. Tell people where you are. And that's all I can say.
Stacy Peterson wasn't Drew Peterson's only wife. As a matter of fact, she was his fourth wife.
As soon as Stacy went missing, that same day, somebody mentioned, well, you know, his third wife died under unusual circumstances. So I asked for the file.
His third wife is gone, and now his fourth wife is missing. You can't tell me that you don't think something's going on here.
When I looked at the autopsy report, it rocked me out of my chair.
This is not an accident. I felt there was definitely cause to do the second autopsy.
A deeper dive into Drew Peterson's past reveals some shocking information.
Drew would reel these women in with the promises and with the honeymoon stage. When that honeymoon stage was over, now it's time to go on to someone else.
We're getting a developing picture of someone who wants the world to kneel before them.
On the one hand, there's the police officer, the apparent good father, but on the other hand, there's a deeper, darker side to Drew Peterson.
It's impossible to ignore that this master manipulator may have covered up some murderous tracks.
It's a game at this point, and the walls are slowly closing in, but Drew Peterson's sticking to his story. Stacy Peterson left.
One week before Stacy and Drew's 4th anniversary, Stacy Peterson is talking about divorce.
We were talking all about her whole situation with Drew and how she wanted out and she wanted to take all 4 of the children. Something was really wrong. I told her that it was time to get out, although I didn't know how she could get out. I didn't feel like there was anything I could do. I knew my hands were tied. It haunts me. I wish I could have done something.
Stacy had asked me how I felt about her getting a divorce. I told her I was scared because of what happened to Kathleen. And she just looked at me with this pale, blank face and said she was scared. And that if anything were to happen to her, that I was to come and find her. If anything were to happen to her, Drew did something to her. I just looked at her and said, let's get the out of here. Let's go. Pack everything up. Let's go. She said she couldn't do it because Drew would find her.
Anyone married to Drew Peterson who says, you know what, I'm out of here. You can't ask to go unless they send you.
We both got up and I went out the garage and it was just this little aisle of clutter, but there was this blue barrel sitting there. And I go, what the hell is that? And she goes, oh, Drew got it, it's for the pool. Chlorine for the pool. And I just went on my way. This is Friday, 2 days before she went missing.
Just a few days into the investigation of Stacy's disappearance, the state police get an unexpected call from an unlikely source.
I identified myself as Kathleen Savio's divorce attorney and someone who had spoken to the woman that they were looking for maybe a day before Stacy went missing.
Smith gives police a startling piece of information.
A day and a half or so before she disappeared. I was a little surprised when my secretary told me that Stacy Peterson was on the line to talk to me about a divorce. She called, asked questions about, I'm going to leave Drew and can I take the kids out of the state? Very normal questions people would ask. But then in that same breath said, do you think we could get more money in the divorce if we tell the police how he killed Kathleen? I say, maybe you shouldn't even be calling my office. And then she's gone 24 hours later. And so I called the state police. Police said they would get back to me, and then I called the state's attorney. And the next day, somebody came to my office, I believe, to interview me.
Stacy made some statements to Harry Smith about the fact that she had some stuff on Drew, which she eventually told him was that he killed Kathleen. He said he could hear Drew yelling at her on that phone conversation.
Police were now paying very close attention to Harry Smith's information.
The people that I was meeting with, everything was falling into place as they were talking to me. I noticed a lot of nods and shaking of the heads.
Including the collection of documents from his former client, Kathleen Savio, before she died.
When they see what's in my divorce file, we have a client writing us letters saying he's going to kill me.
We got all the statements. He said that he could kill me and make it look like an accident. And that was another critical piece of evidence.
It had been years, and this poor woman had tried to warn all of us. Somebody should have seen more in this the first time.
So how did police miss what seemed so obvious to everyone else around them?
So frustrating for the family of Kathleen Savio. There were documented instances of allegations of abuse, breaking and entering, of stalking. Those things were there. I don't think Ray McGurry had any idea of any of this when he took the job. I don't think he had any idea of any of this until Stacy disappeared.
Nothing in his record, to my knowledge, indicates any type of domestic violence, excessive use of force. None of that exists. I became the police chief for the village of Bolingbrook in August of 2005. Mike Calcagno was the chief, and he was retiring. I should have known that Kathleen Savio and Drew Peterson had domestics. Didn't know it.
Did a simple changing of the guard allow Drew Peterson to get away with murder?
Ray McGurry became Bolingbrook police chief long after Kathleen Savio's death had been classified an accident.
That's my frustration sitting here today. That's why I've shut my mouth for 10 years and said nothing, because in retrospect, I probably should have known that. It's my fault for not digging deeper.
After years of turning a blind eye, the Bolingbrook Police Department will not lead the investigation.
It was probably mid to late week, that first week that Stacy was missing, that the state police took over. It was their investigation, and I get that. You don't want the department to investigate their own because it casts some doubt as to whether or not they're going to be fair and open-minded about the investigation. And it was like, thanks, Chief, we'll get back to you if we need you.
As the investigation proceeds, police receive incredible information that will flip the missing person case on its head. From none other than Drew Peterson's own stepbrother.
Tom Morphy is Drew Peterson's stepbrother. Tom told the police the last day Stacy was seen, Drew called him up and had him help him carry a blue barrel down from their bedroom and loaded it into Drew's SUV. He said he never looked inside the barrel, didn't know what was inside the barrel.
Drew Peterson then drives to drop Tom Morphy off. Drew is gone for 2 hours before he's back home.
The state police asked me, did you see a blue barrel anywhere? And, you were over here a week before or 2 weeks before. Did you see? No, I didn't see any blue barrels anywhere.
Police begin an exhaustive search for the blue barrel.
Tom Morphy says he has no idea where Stacy is, in addition to never even looking in the barrel after he loaded it into Drew's SUV, that he has no idea where Drew took it.
With this horrifying new revelation, the case to find Stacy Peterson quickly evolves into a homicide hunt.
There were extensive searches. We searched the canals. That was a real labor-intensive effort.
They would search on the water to see if they could find an inevitable blue barrel that everyone was looking for.
The search intensifies, but the state's attorney is working a different angle to make Drew Peterson answer for his crimes.
So we needed to get the second autopsy to examine Kathleen's body. This was absolutely critical. Obviously, if we couldn't prove it was a murder, we're not even in the ballgame. Within 10 days, we did an exhumation.
The process to unearth Kathleen Savio's body began with a backhoe breaking through the earth at Queen of Heaven Cemetery.
The renewed focus on Kathleen's death is a moment the Savio family has been waiting for.
I knew that he was involved with it. I just knew it.
When Stacy went missing, I knew she wasn't going to come home. But when I heard that they were going to open up my sister's case, I was happy, surprised, and angered. Why does it take a woman to go missing for you to open up my sister's case when you didn't listen the first time?
My initial reaction was they're just digging at straws to get him on something. Never in a million years thought that's what was going to get him.
Medical examiner Dr. Michael Baden is called in to perform a new autopsy on the exhumed body of Kathleen Savio. Journalist Steph Watts makes an arrangement with the Savio family to document the autopsy as it happens.
Dr. Baden would be able to report whatever he found once he performed the autopsy, good news or bad news, to the family. I was allowed to be in the room and film Dr. Baden and write a report about everything I saw.
How would you describe the condition of the body?
In not very good condition. When we exhumed her, from like the top of her thighs down was completely deteriorated because water had gotten into the casket but did not destroy the areas we needed to examine.
I remember thinking, Savio family, I wouldn't want them to see her like this because it didn't look human. That sight sticks with me to this day.
When you fall backwards violently, what's going to happen? Well, your arms are going to hit, your back's going to hit, your shoulders, your buttocks, your lower back. When you examine for any bruises on the back, the buttocks, back of the arms, there weren't any. She had 2 bruises, equidistant here on the front chest. How are you going to get those? You're not going to get them in a fall in a bathtub. On the iliac crest of her hip, there were 3 separate deep bruises. Could not possibly be caused in a single fall.
We have to go straight back with the family.
At the end of the autopsy, Dr. Baden and I leave. We meet with the family, and he tells the family that he's 100% certain that Kathleen Savio was murdered.
When we were at the coroner's office, Dr. Baden sat down and talked to us.
It's my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that's a homicide, and that's what I would have put down on the death certificate.
He said, this is what it is. It's a homicide. She struggled. And I just collapsed, and I just started crying because I knew that she fought for her life.
We proved beyond all doubt that she was murdered. And then after she's murdered, then who would have murdered her is the next step.
Ten days into the Stacy Peterson investigation, the body of her husband's third wife, Kathleen Savio, is exhumed so a new autopsy can be performed. Contrary to the first ruling of accidental drowning, the re-examining of the body reveals death by homicide. Those closest to Drew Peterson are now forced to look again at these cases.
I was in just complete shock that, wow, everything we've believed up until this point could possibly be untrue. And so it was just a lot of different, a lot to take in.
When they did Kathy's autopsy and they said that there were no drugs or alcohol in her system, I felt bad. Drew had given us that story about her maybe taking something and drinking a glass of wine. He lied to all of us. Why would he lie? Unless he had something to cover up.
There's accidental deaths, there's murder, there's car crashes, there's disappearances. There's an awful lot of bad things happen around Drew Peterson.
The results of the second autopsy shift the state attorney's focus onto Kathleen Savio's death.
This was not an accident. This was a homicide. Those words changed everything and entirely changed the direction of this investigation, that it was not about Stacey Peterson anymore. We were now uber focused on what happened to Kathleen Savio.
It crossed my mind in 2007 when I started this that this was going to be an uphill battle. But I knew from that circumstantial evidence that he did it, and we had to build the case. Our proofs were stronger relative to the murder of Kathleen Savio, and that's why we chose to go on that case first.
This case has certainly taken a new turn. No arrests have been made, but Officer Peterson now has been officially relieved of duty at the police department without pay, pending an internal investigation.
Can you look me straight in the eye and tell me that you had nothing to do with the death of your third wife, Kathy, or the disappearance of your fourth wife, Stacey?
I can look right in your eye and say I had nothing to do with either of those incidences.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Peterson, you like to say anything?
It's been over 2 weeks since Stacey's disappearance, but Drew Peterson doesn't seem concerned or even fazed by the media's attention. In fact, he seems to enjoy being in the spotlight.
Everything with Drew Peterson was incredibly orchestrated. Drew Peterson coming out with a mask on his face.
Sergeant Peterson, seen last week wearing sunglasses and a bandana.
I think he started to realize that, hey, maybe I can just work this. I can, charm them.
Show what it's like to be Drew Peterson.
Drew Peterson coming out with a video camera, deciding he was going to tape the media. For what purposes? For the purposes of being a show-off.
Watching him become more comfortable in the limelight was a little disconcerting. Do you know why that they're so interested in you? Do you get this?
He's a narcissistic sociopath that just has no conscience and just believes that he can get away with anything.
Peterson apparently agreed to participate in a contest entitled Win a Date with Drew.
I hated every bit of him going out there and making jokes, and you got a missing person and another dead one, and he's out making jokes and the win a date with Drew and all this other stupid stuff that they were doing, and it drove me nuts.
It was very frustrating to watch him do all this, to carry on like he was. And you've got 4 kids at home. Your focus should be on them, not out here being excited about talking to the media.
Although the state attorney's focus is clear, the ongoing investigation into the Stacey Peterson disappearance turns up a new witness with information about the Kathleen Savio murder.
As soon as Stacey disappeared, I had no doubt that she was dead. I am confident that Drew made her disappear, and I'm also confident she doesn't want me to be quiet about that. And now I am giving information that could possibly lead to his arrest and permanent incarceration. That felt risky, but it honestly felt riskier to my own heart and my own soul to not do it.
Stacey had been in counseling with Pastor Shorey and had confided details far more chilling than just marital problems.
The statements that Stacey made to Reverend Shorey were probably the single most important statements that came in. Stacey confided in Reverend Shorey because she knew Drew killed Kathy. He admitted it to her. And I'm going to tell you what to tell the police, and if you do, it'll be the perfect crime.
Given the lack of a real investigation when Kathleen Savio's body was found, there was no forensic evidence and no witnesses to connect Drew Peterson to her murder.
The statements that Stacey made to Reverend Shorey were very critical.
In 2009, 18 months after the disappearance of Stacy, prosecutor James Glasgow builds a case against Drew Peterson and is ready to charge him with the murder of his former wife, Kathleen Salvio.
There was no one with animosity towards Kathy Salvio. You know, it's standard, there's got to be somebody out there that doesn't like you. No one else was out there with a motive to kill her, except Drew Peterson.
On May 7, 2009, Drew Peterson is arrested for murder.
Drew Peterson was charged with the murder of his third wife, Kathleen Salvio, and I had a sense that Kathy was going to have her say, finally.
My role in this was always, if he gets arrested or anything happens to him, go get the kids. Once he got arrested, the kids all came to live with me, and then shortly thereafter, my marriage fell apart. It's a lot of stress. Basically what it comes down to is a lot of stress.
Peterson maintains he had nothing to do with Salvio's death or Stacy's disappearance.
When Drew Peterson was threatening his wife, Kathy, he even went so far as saying he was going to kill her and make it look like an accident. It was his understanding of the law at that time. If he killed Kathy Salvio, those statements would die with her.
With neither Kathleen nor Stacy able to testify, prosecutors face a serious challenge.
Jim Glasgow, the state attorney who tried Drew Peterson, he had no eyewitnesses. He had no physical evidence.
Jim Glasgow goes to great lengths to get Drew's law onto the books.
Drew's law is the law that the state's attorney for Will County, James Glasgow, pushed. Basically, you could introduce hearsay evidence into the trial from a deceased person. Is dangerous because there's no way of the defense or anybody to question the person making the original statement.
Turns out passing the hearsay bill may play a key role in making sure statements the two women made to a third party are allowed into court.
There was an 8-week hearing in 2010 to determine what statements were going to be allowed. And in order to even get to the point where they would be allowed, we had to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that he had killed both Kathy and Stacy with the intent to silence them.
The prosecution would have to ensure that what Stacy Peterson admitted to the pastor would in fact be admissible in court in order for Drew Peterson to be found guilty.
She told me a very detailed story. Drew came to her and he said, "If you do this right, this will be the perfect crime."
Coming up, will Stacy's words put Drew Peterson behind bars for murder?
I remember sitting in front of the TV, and when they came back with the verdict, it was like, wow.
It was overwhelming. This kind of all came to a head.
In 2007, Stacy Peterson goes missing, and 2 years later, her husband Drew Peterson is arrested for the 2004 murder of his third wife, Kathleen Salvio. Pastor Shorey had been a confidant of Stacy's.
The information that Stacy had about Kathleen's murder, this was explosive.
And State Attorney Jim Glasgow is pushing for those conversations to be admitted in court.
We had to prove that he had killed both Kathy and Stacy with the intent to silence them.
One of the reasons why it took so long for Drew to come to trial is because the state attorney, Jim Glasgow, was trying to get a law passed that would allow hearsay evidence.
Think about the other side. You get rid of the witness and you walk in front of the judge and say, "Ha ha, judge, can't get me now." I mean, that's not how our system works.
It's a repeat of the old RICO statutes. You're not going to benefit from your wrongdoing. By silencing a witness, you are now going to be found not guilty. So in theory, hearsay statements that come from Kathleen Salvio, they wanted her, the victim, to be heard.
If you intentionally make a witness unavailable for trial, then you can't complain if a third party testifies to relevant and probative material against you. And it's called forfeiture by wrongdoing because you forfeit your right to cross-examine the individual by your wrongdoing.
Pastor Shorey must take the stand in the pretrial hearing to determine if this hearsay can be used in the murder trial.
In the preliminary hearing, Drew tried to menace me when I sat down on the stand. Actually, when nobody else was paying any attention, before the court convened, he sat at his table and he stared at me and he looked forward and he was posturing. and he was mouthing words to me. He was really aggressive, and his face got red, and he's saying things. And I remember I looked at the judge. The judge isn't paying any attention. And I looked at the state's attorney's table. They weren't paying any attention. I'm thinking, am I the only person who sees this guy is sitting here and he's threatening me right here in the courtroom? Nobody saw it. And then finally, we both sort of slowly looked away from each other. And I remember looking at Drew and I thought, you're not going to win this.
In 2011, the Illinois Supreme Court rules in favor of Glasgow. This is a huge victory for the prosecution's case.
Having this ability opened a lot of new doors, which I was very happy about.
8 years after Kathleen Savio's death, and more than 4 since Stacy Peterson's disappearance, the words of these 2 women will finally be heard in court. On July 31st, 2012, the Drew Peterson trial begins. 15 days in, Pastor Shorey is called to give his account of Stacy's words before she disappeared.
Almost as soon as I sat down on the stand, I got completely calm. I was ready. I was ready to tell the story. It was August 31st, 2007. Stacy said, I know it's very last minute, but I really, really need to meet with you. Stacy talked just about marriage and her life, and at one point she kind of paused and she just blurts out, he did it. Who's he? He did what? And she said, Drew killed Kathleen. She told me a very detailed story about how one night she and Drew went to bed at the same time, and she woke up in the middle of the night and he wasn't there. She said hours later, he came into the house and walked into the laundry room and he was carrying a bag. And she said he was dressed in all black head to toe. He opened up the washer and he dumped all the items that were in the bag into the washer. She said, Drew, what are you doing? Where were you? And she said, he wouldn't say anything except, you know where I was. And walked out of the room. She said she didn't know what was going on, so she opened up the washing machine. And she looked in, and not only were they the clothes that he was wearing and he took off, but there were women's clothes in there that were not hers. And then over the next couple of hours, he came to her and he said that he had hit Kathleen on the back of the head. And then he put her in the bathtub to make it look like she'd drowned. He said, pretty soon, the police are going to show up here. And he coached her for hours on what she was supposed to say. And he said, if you do this right, this will be the perfect crime.
Drew was sunk by his own words and actions. He did everything he could to silence these women. But little did he know that those women had reached out to other people, and they did the right thing. They told somebody their story.
Problem with hearsay, obviously, it's unreliable and anybody can say anything. You know, there's nothing from stopping me from going in there and saying, well, Kathy told me she fell a lot in the tub.
The statements that Stacy made to Reverend Shorey were probably the single most important statements that came in. Reverend Shorey was the linchpin, the courage that he showed. We're talking about a guy that's very dangerous.
Police officer holds probably the most noble profession in our society. Every day, they place their lives on the line for us. We place our trust in those police officers, but Drew Peterson violated it at the highest level. He betrayed the public trust, the sacred trust.
After deliberating for nearly 14 hours, over 3 days, on the charge of first-degree murder, the jury returns its verdict.
I remember sitting in front of the TV, and when they came back with the verdict, it was like, wow. They really did it. They found him guilty.
Drew was found guilty. I felt good about it, really good about it. It was so much relief, finally, because I really thought he was going to get away with it.
When the verdict came in and he was convicted of murder, I think my first reaction was just, it was overwhelming. I'll say that. I mean, I broke down and cried for 20 minutes. Everything that we dealt with for the last 5 years or however long it was, just kind of all came to a head. The trial sucked and there was no evidence. I mean, it's the police and me where you want some kind of evidence or something, and then you realize, okay, now it's permanent, that I'm going to be raising these kids, and, you know, it was a lot.
I was in the courtroom. It felt like a relief to know that he wouldn't be able to get out of jail and hurt anyone else in our family or anyone else's family.
At his sentencing hearing, after months of silence, Drew Peterson addresses the court.
My name is Drew Peterson. I hope I've not aggravated the situation here, but I have a lot of things I think need to be said. Say whatever you choose. And I'm forced to sit silent since the beginning of all this. I did not kill Kathleen!
I saw the devil. I didn't even think. I just said,
yes, you did.
There won't be any comments from the audience. You're all kept. Ma'am, I'd like you to leave the courtroom.
I was escorted out of the courtroom.
Drew Peterson delivers a 45-minute tirade against the court, lawyers, the media, and his wives.
There was a continuous illegal activity by the state's attorney's office, including the state's attorney himself. The state took an accident and staged documentary. Well, this was kind of took place under the nose and in the eyes of the court.
He blamed me for everything, which I was very happy about. I want to make sure he understood that.
Drew Peterson is sentenced to 38 years in prison.
Do you believe your father, Drew Peterson, killed Kathleen Savio?
I think part of me wants to believe that my father had nothing to do with Kathleen's murder. I think over time, I've come to the conclusion that he probably did have something to do with Kathleen's murder.
Now, the friends and family of Stacy say they want Drew Peterson charged with her death as well.
When Drew got convicted for Kathleen, no justice was done for Stacy. He's never been prosecuted for Stacy.
Kathy got justice. Now we have to work on getting Stacy the justice she deserves.
It was a relief. I felt good. But then again, I believe Drew Peterson got away with my sister's disappearance. I can't give a shit where he's at, you know? He killed her.
When the verdict came in, I was sitting here just watching TV. The news flash came up. Brace for it.
Drew Peterson convicted of murdering his third wife, Kathleen Savio.
Guilty.
It took the jury just 13 hours to find the flamboyant former Bolingbrook, Illinois police officer Drew Peterson guilty of the murder of his third wife, Kathleen Savio.
Drew Peterson was sentenced to 38 years, and that's 38 real years. Every minute must be served. There's no parole or early release.
Despite this murder conviction and sentence, it appears Drew Peterson is not done yet, even from behind bars.
I received a letter at our office from an inmate saying they have information involving me personally.
In August of 2014, the state's attorney's office decides to interview the individual who wrote the letter, an inmate at the same prison Drew Peterson is incarcerated.
Okay, that's the letter that you wrote to our office. Attention James Glasgow.
Antonio Smith was a young man who, when we went to interview him, told them about conversations between him and Drew Peterson.
He said that James Glasgow wanted just to get me. I mean, he's behind everything. When James Glasgow's trying to take his pension.
He wasn't asking us for anything. He just wanted to let me know that Drew Peterson tried to hire him to kill me.
You got somebody who will take care of James Glasgow? I said, what do you mean? He said, kill him.
Antonio Smith agrees to wear a wire and cooperate with authorities.
Peterson explained during these recordings that he wanted me gone. And Antonio Smith said he had his uncle who would kill me.
Before you give the green light on your uncle, talk to me. Get the green light on. Basically, go ahead and kill him. All right. That's what you wanted, right? It ain't no turning back. The first time we talked about it, there was no turning back.
I think Peterson couldn't have defined himself more than what you hear on those tapes.
If I get some booze in here, we'll celebrate that.
They're laughing about how they're going to party when I'm dead. Certainly not the behavior of an innocent man.
Today, the former Bolingbrook cop learned he'll spend an additional 40 years behind bars for trying to arrange the murder of the man who put him there.
Everything's coming together. Karma's catching up with him. He's, gonna stay in prison forever.
Drew Peterson is now behind bars for 78 years.
When he was charged with trying to hire a hitman to kill Glasgow, I think my reaction, like most people, was no way, he couldn't be that stupid. But then you hear the tapes, and it's pretty clear what was going on. That's pretty embarrassing. I mean, I can't believe he would even risk doing something like that.
Being in jail doesn't turn it off. It's not all of a sudden, okay, I'm caught, I'm in the big house, and now I have to behave in a proper manner. Sometimes it makes them act out even more, such as putting a hit out on a district attorney.
Drew got more time for a murder for hire than for actually killing somebody.
For Cassandra and her family, Drew will get away with Stacy's murder if they don't find her remains.
We've not yet found Stacy Peterson's body. We have no active leads right now. The search that was done was truly expansive in its scope, and we followed every lead that came up. That doesn't mean that a murder prosecution won't come in the future. We have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she's dead and not hiding something. Obviously, the longer that she's gone, the easier it will be to convince a jury that she didn't run away and that she's dead.
My sister Stacy's disappearance is still an open investigation. Hundreds of people send messages or emails. If it's something like a lady just emails and says, "Oh, I had a dream. I looked at a map and here's where I think she is." And I'll go look.
Do you think that Drew killed Stacy?
Well, I have no additional information or any evidence that would prove it. I do believe my father had something to do with Stacy's disappearance.
I believe Drew Peterson killed her. I believe that Stacy had gotten off the phone with Bruce, because Bruce was the last one to talk to her. Stacy had said she was going to get herself up and motivated, take care of the kids, and then she would be out. I believe she probably said some things or whatever and killed her right there.
For Cassandra, the blue barrel in the Peterson garage remains a key to finding Stacy and understanding what happened to her.
I believe Drew somehow got the barrel upstairs into the bedroom, lined the barrel with plastic, because Tom Morphy said when he moved the barrel out, there was plastic sticking out.
Tom Morphy, Drew's stepbrother, has said he helped Drew move a blue barrel when Stacy disappeared, which Cassandra believes is the same one she saw 2 days before.
They carry the barrel out, and Drew Peterson is gone for 2 hours. I believe that Stacy's in the canal.
A part of this whole story that makes it rough is that I'm living in this house. I try not to think about what could have happened here or what did happen here. We just moved in and eventually made it our own.
Stacy Peterson is still missing, so until Stacy's brought home and Drew is convicted, her family's not going to rest. The story's far from over.
Stacy's birthday. She would have been 33 years old.
I like that picture.
Here's me and Stacy.
Yeah, I like that one too.
I remember this one. We went to, I think it was like JCPenney. The lady went back, so we started trying on all the costumes and taking our own pictures. And then we got yelled at.
I remember that. We still don't have any answers. But you still have to search, you know?
She asked me to find her if anything happened to her. So I won't stop. She was my best friend. And she was my everything, and he took that away from me, and I will not stop until I bring her home. No matter the cost or what I have to do, whether it's legal or illegal, I will do it.
Anybody who's close to this situation, I think, has gone through the same thing. That you think, if I would have done something different, you go through that a lot. Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I save her?
Where is she? Where is Stacy? What is the truth? We just want the truth.
I will be the one responsible for finding my sister.
In the history of American true crime, some cases are remembered because of the evidence left behind. Others are remembered because of the brutality of the crimes, the suffering of the victims, or the persistence of investigators who refuse to let a case disappear. The story of Paul John Knowles is remembered for something different: uncertainty. Knowles claimed that he had killed 35 people. Investigators were able to connect him with a substantially smaller number, commonly described as at least 18. Between those two numbers lies a question that can never be answered with certainty. How many people did Paul John Knowles actually kill? The difficulty begins with the man himself. Knowles did not simply remain silent after his arrest. He talked. He described killings. He provided names and details. Some of those statements eventually helped investigators identify a victim. Others could not be independently verified. Some claims were questioned by investigators. And because Knowles died before he could ever stand trial, there would never be a courtroom examination in which every one of his statements could be tested against evidence. His story, therefore, remained suspended between what could be established and what could only be claimed. In 1974, Knowles moved through several American states in a remarkably short period. Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, Texas, Alabama, Connecticut, and Virginia became connected to a trail of deaths and disappearances attributed to him. The victims were not a single type of person. They differed in age, circumstances, and location. Some were encountered in homes. Others crossed paths with him while traveling. Some disappeared. Others were found dead. The methods attributed to Knowles also varied. There was no single pattern that could immediately identify every crime as the work of one person. That movement was one of the most important features of the case. A local investigator looking at one killing could see one crime. Another investigator in another state could see another. The connection between them was not always obvious. And while those investigations were unfolding, Knowles kept moving. His story had begun long before the killings of 1974. Paul John Knowles was born on April 25, 1946, in Orlando, Florida. His childhood was unstable, and he spent periods living with foster families. By approximately the age of 19, he had begun committing crimes and had spent time in prison for offenses that included theft and car theft. By early 1974, he was incarcerated at Rayford Prison in Florida. There, he began corresponding with a woman in California named Angela Kovic. Their correspondence developed into a romantic relationship. Kovic even helped with legal expenses intended to assist Knowles in obtaining his release. In May 1974, Knowles was released on parole. He traveled to California with the intention of marrying Kovic. But the marriage never happened. Kovic changed her mind, and after only a few days, Knowles left California. He returned to Florida. The relationship had ended, but Knowles's freedom would not last. He was arrested again following an assault. Then, on July 26, 1974, he escaped custody by opening a lock. That date marked the beginning of the period for which his name would become associated with a string of murders across multiple states. Almost immediately after escaping, Knowles entered the home of Alice Henrietta Curtis in Jacksonville, Florida. Curtis was 65 years old. According to the supplied case information, Knowles restrained her and placed a gag in her mouth while searching the house. He took property and her vehicle. But the restraint that had been intended to silence her became fatal. Curtis died from suffocation caused by the gag. Knowles then left in her vehicle. It was the first killing in the period that followed his escape and the beginning of a trail that would eventually stretch far beyond Florida. Within days, 2 young girls disappeared in the Jacksonville area. Lillian Anderson was 11 years old. Her sister, Mylette Anderson, was 7. Both disappeared on August 1, 1974. Knowles later claimed that he had abducted and killed them. But unlike some of the other cases associated with him, their bodies were never found. Investigators later questioned whether Knowles had actually committed these killings. That uncertainty would become central to understanding his entire confession. The number 35 came from Knowles himself, and investigators could not simply accept every claim because he had spoken it aloud. A confession can contain truth, but in this case, the person providing the confession had an obvious interest in the story surrounding him. The recording showed that Knowles was interested in attention and in the value of his statements too. The media that made his words both potentially valuable and potentially unreliable. The same day that Lillian and Mylette Anderson disappeared, another young victim would become connected to Knowles' story. Imogene Sanders, 13 years old, disappeared in Warner Robins, Georgia. For years, the identity of a young victim described by Knowles in recordings under another name remained unresolved. Then, in 2011, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified that victim as Imogene Sanders. The identification was significant because it demonstrated that at least part of Knowles' recorded account contained information corresponding to a real missing person. But it did not solve the larger mystery surrounding all of his claims. The following day, August 2nd, another woman became associated with the growing trail. Marjorie Howie, 49, was killed in Atlantic Beach, Florida. She was found to have been strangled with a nylon stocking. Her television was missing, and the circumstances suggested that theft may have been involved. In less than 2 weeks, the man who had escaped custody in Florida had already become connected to deaths and disappearances in Florida and Georgia. Yet there was no indication that the trail would remain in the southeast. Knowles was moving, and each new location created another fragment of the story. What made the case so disturbing was not simply the number of victims attributed to him. It was the way the individual lives behind those cases could disappear into a rapidly expanding geographical pattern. Alice Curtis had been in her own home. Lillian and Mylette Anderson were children who vanished without their bodies being recovered. Imogene Sanders was a 13-year-old whose identity would remain unresolved for decades. Marjorie Howie was found dead in Atlantic Beach. Each case was a separate human tragedy, but over time they became pieces of a much larger investigation. And at the center of that investigation was a man who had already demonstrated that he could escape custody, cross state lines, assume different roles around different people, and leave investigators with questions that would outlive him. The killings had only just begun. The trail would soon move farther south, west, and north, leaving more victims, more vehicles, more disappearances, and eventually more confessions. But before investigators could determine which of Knowles' words were true, they would first have to follow the physical trail he left behind. And that trail was already stretching across America. To understand the events that began on July 26, 1974, it is necessary to look backward. Before the disappearances, before the bodies were found, and before Paul John Knowles became known across several states as the Casanova Killer. The man who escaped custody that summer did not suddenly appear without a history. His life before 1974 was marked by instability, repeated criminal behavior, imprisonment, and relationships that would eventually place him in circumstances far removed from where he had begun. Paul John Knowles was born on April 25, 1946, in Orlando, Florida. His childhood was unstable, and he spent periods living with foster families. The supplied information does not provide a complete account of those early years, but it does establish that his upbringing lacked stability. By approximately the age of 19, Knowles had begun committing crimes. His offenses included theft and car theft, and his repeated contact with the criminal justice system eventually led to imprisonment. By early 1974, he was incarcerated at Rayford Prison in Florida. At that point, there was no indication that the name Paul John Knowles would soon become connected to a series of deaths stretching across the country. Instead, his life was still defined by confinement and the possibility of release. While in prison, Knowles began writing letters to Angela Kovic, a woman living in California. Their correspondence developed into a romantic relationship. The relationship was significant because it eventually contributed to Knowles leaving prison and traveling across the country. Kovic went beyond simply corresponding with him. She helped with legal expenses intended to assist Knowles in obtaining his release. In May 1974, Knowles was released on parole. He traveled to California with the intention of marrying Kovic. From the outside, the journey could have represented a new beginning. Knowles had been released from prison, had someone waiting for him in another state, and had a stated plan for marriage. But the plan did not survive the journey. Kovic changed her mind. The marriage never took place. After only a few days in California, Knowles left and returned to Florida. The relationship that had helped give him a path out of prison had ended. What happened next would become the dividing line between the earlier criminal history of Paul John Knowles and the violent period that made him infamous. After returning to Florida, Knowles was arrested again following an assault. He was once more in custody, but this time, confinement did not last. On July 26, 1974, Knowles escaped by opening a lock. The escape was not merely another episode in his criminal record. It placed him outside official supervision at precisely the moment when his subsequent crimes began. The first victim connected to this period was Alice Henrietta Curtis, a 65-year-old woman in Jacksonville, Florida. On the same day that Knowles escaped, he entered Curtis's home. The circumstances described in the supplied case information indicate that this was initially connected to theft. Knowles restrained Curtis and placed a gag in her mouth while searching the house. He took property and her vehicle, but the gag became fatal. Curtis died from suffocation. Knowles then left in her vehicle. Her death established the first known point on the trail that would follow him for the next several months. There was a stark difference between the man who had traveled to California intending to marry Angela Kovic and the fugitive who now moved through Jacksonville in a stolen vehicle. Yet the supplied information gives no reason to romanticize or psychologically simplify that transformation. It is enough to say that after his escape, Knowles began a period of violence that would leave numerous victims and unanswered questions. Within days, the investigation became more complicated. On August 1st, two sisters, Lillian Anderson, 11, and Mylette Anderson, 7, disappeared in the Jacksonville area. Knowles later claimed that he had abducted and killed them, but their bodies were never found. This case would become one of the clearest examples of the problem investigators faced with. Knowles's later confessions. His willingness to speak did not automatically establish that every statement was true. Investigators later questioned whether he had actually killed the Anderson sisters. Their disappearance, therefore, remained surrounded by uncertainty. The issue would become even more important when Knowles eventually claimed a much larger number of victims. If a suspect says he killed 35 people, Investigators must determine which claims can be supported by evidence and which cannot. The disappearance of Lillian and Mylette Anderson showed why that distinction mattered. On the same date, another young person disappeared in Georgia. Imogene Sanders was 13 years old when she vanished in Warner Robins. Her case would remain unresolved for years. Knowles later described a young victim in recordings under another name. For a long time, investigators did not know who that person was. Then, in 2011, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified the victim as Imogene Sanders. That later identification became an important piece of the larger Knowles story. It showed that at least part of his recorded account corresponded to a real missing child whose identity had remained unresolved for decades. But it did not mean that every statement he made could be accepted without question. The distinction between the two cases is crucial. In one, a later investigation provided a link between Knowles' description and the identity of a missing girl. In the other, 2 children disappeared and their bodies were never recovered, leaving investigators uncertain about Knowles' claim. The same man had provided statements about both. The evidence did not carry the same weight. On August 2nd, one day after the disappearance of the Anderson sisters and Sanders, another woman became connected to the growing trail. Marjorie Howie, 49, was killed in Atlantic Beach, Florida. She was found dead after being strangled with a nylon stocking. Her television was missing. The circumstances suggested that theft may have been part of the crime. By this point, the geographic pattern was beginning to widen. Jacksonville had been followed by Atlantic Beach in Florida and Warner Robins in Georgia. But the most important fact was not simply that the crimes were occurring in different places. It was that the person believed responsible was moving with them. Knowles had escaped custody in Florida, and now a trail of deaths and disappearances was beginning to extend beyond the location of that escape. There was also a second pattern emerging. Vehicles and possessions could become part of the movement. Curtis's vehicle had been taken after her death. Later, another vehicle would become an important link in the case involving William Bates. As Knowles traveled, transportation allowed him to move from one jurisdiction to another, while the investigations remained divided between local authorities. The result was a case that would eventually span enormous distances, but begin with individual victims whose lives had nothing to do with one another. Alice Curtis was 65. Lillian and Mylette Anderson were children. Imogene Sanders was 13. Marjorie Howie was 49. Their ages and circumstances were different, yet all became connected to the same fugitive. It is important to keep those individual identities visible because the scale of the later investigation can make the victims seem like entries in a list. They were not. Each name represented a person whose life ended or disappeared during a period of extraordinary violence. For investigators, however, the challenge was becoming increasingly practical. Knowles was no longer confined to one location. He was a fugitive who could move, steal vehicles, and cross state boundaries. Every new jurisdiction created another piece of the puzzle. The murders did not arrive as a single case file. They emerged separately, and the connections would only become clearer later. The events of the first days after his escape therefore established the central problem that would define the entire investigation. How do you determine the truth when the suspect himself becomes one of the main sources of information, while simultaneously remaining someone whose statements cannot all be trusted? That question would follow Knowles throughout the remainder of 1974. And as he moved away from Florida and deeper into the country, the trail would become longer, the victims more numerous, and the task of separating verified facts from his own claims increasingly difficult. The escape on July 26th had opened the door. What followed would turn that brief flight from custody into one of the most geographically scattered criminal episodes associated with an American serial killer in 1974. By the end of August 1974, the trail associated with Paul John Knowles was no longer confined to the streets and neighborhoods of Florida and Georgia. The pattern was becoming more difficult to contain. Knowles was moving from place to place, and the people who crossed his path were increasingly different from one another. Some were encountered in their homes. Others met him while traveling. Some cases involved robbery. Others ended in strangulation or shooting. And in at least one case, a child survived after her mother was killed. For investigators, each crime represented a separate tragedy. But as Knowles continued moving, those separate investigations would eventually begin to form a much larger picture. On August 23, 1974, in Musella, Georgia, Knowles entered the home of Kathy Sue Pierce. Pierce was approximately 24 years old. According to the supplied information, Knowles killed her by strangling her with a telephone cord. The detail that makes the case particularly disturbing is that Pierce's 3-year-old son was also inside the home. The child survived. The available information does not provide a complete account of what the child witnessed or what happened afterward, so those details cannot responsibly be reconstructed. What can be established is that a very young child was present in the house when his mother was killed. That fact alone places the crime in a different emotional category from an isolated confrontation between two adults. For those investigating the case, it was another indication of how quickly Knowles could move from entering a home to committing a killing. The telephone cord used in Pierce's death also reflected a method that would appear elsewhere in the cases associated with Knowles: strangulation using whatever object was available. But even here, it would be misleading to suggest that he had a single fixed method. The later cases would show that his violence could take different forms. After the Georgia killings, Knowles moved north. By early September, he was in Ohio. On September 3, 1974, in Lima, Ohio, William Bates, 32, encountered a man described as having red hair at a roadside establishment. Bates disappeared afterward. The encounter became important because another piece of the earlier Florida trail appeared nearby. The vehicle belonging to Alice Curtis was found abandoned in the area, while Bates's own vehicle had disappeared. The connection between a stolen vehicle from Florida and a missing man in Ohio was part of the physical trail left behind by Knowles. Eventually, in October, Bates's body was found in a wooded area. He had been strangled. Knowles was believed to have taken Bates's vehicle, money, and credit cards before continuing his journey. The significance of Bates's case was not simply that another man had died. It demonstrated how transportation and stolen property could help extend the geographic reach of the crime. Knowles could move into a new state in a vehicle associated with a previous victim, then leave behind another missing person and another stolen vehicle. Every jurisdiction could therefore receive a different piece of the same story without immediately seeing the complete pattern. The movement continued. On September 18th, Knowles was in Ely, Nevada. There he encountered an older couple who were camping, Emmett Alexander Johnson and Lois Mildred Johnson. Both were killed in the area where they had stopped. Unlike the previous cases involving strangulation, the Johnsons were shot. This change in method was important. It demonstrated that there was no single signature method that could be used to identify every crime associated with Knowles. The violence could take different forms depending on the circumstances. The Johnsons' deaths also emphasized the unpredictability of the victims. They were an older married couple who happened to cross paths with Knowles while traveling. There was no single demographic profile that explained the people he targeted. A young woman, a child, an older woman, a middle-aged man, and now an older couple could all appear within the same rapidly expanding trail. 3 days later, on September 21st, Knowles was in Seguin, Texas. There he encountered Eben Charlin Hicks, 42. According to the supplied case information, Hicks had experienced trouble with her motorcycle when she met Knowles. What may initially have been an encounter involving assistance or transportation ended in murder. Hicks was sexually assaulted and strangled, and her body was later found beside the road. Her case added another dimension to the growing investigation. It also reinforced the fact that Knowles's encounters could begin under circumstances that did not immediately suggest the violence that followed. A person experiencing a problem with a vehicle could encounter a stranger. A traveler could meet another traveler. A person could open the door of her own home. These ordinary circumstances could suddenly become dangerous when Knowles entered the picture. By this stage, the geographical scale of his movements was remarkable. Florida had been followed by Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, and Texas. In a matter of weeks, Knowles had traveled across an enormous portion of the United States. The distance itself created a significant investigative obstacle. Local authorities generally dealt with the crime immediately in front of them. The murder of an elderly woman in one state, the disappearance of a man in another, and the deaths of an older couple thousands of miles away might initially appear to have nothing in common. The connection would have to be discovered later. That is one reason the physical evidence associated with vehicles, property, and movements became so important. Knowles could cross a state line more easily than information could be shared across jurisdictions. But the trail was not composed solely of confirmed killings. Some of the most difficult cases involved people who disappeared and were never found. Their names would later become part of Knowles's own confessions. But the absence of recovered bodies made certainty much harder. This distinction would become increasingly important as the year progressed. Knowles would eventually claim 35 victims. Yet investigators could reliably connect him to a substantially smaller number. The difference between those figures was not a technical detail. It represented real uncertainty about individual lives and deaths. Every unverified confession raised the same question: was Knowles describing something he had actually done, or was he adding another crime to his story? At this stage, however, the full scale of that problem had not yet emerged. Knowles was still moving, and more victims would follow. The supplied record places another disappearance only days after Hicks's death. On September 23rd, Knowles met Dawson in Birmingham, Alabama. The two began traveling together. Around September 29th, Dawson disappeared. Knowles later claimed that he had killed her and thrown her body into the Mississippi River. But Dawson's body was never recovered. Her case, therefore, belongs among the cases linked to Knowles with less complete confirmation. The claim was part of his later account, but the physical evidence needed to establish the killing was not available. That distinction would remain important long after Knowles himself was dead. The sequence of events during September reveals something essential about the investigation. The trail was expanding in two directions at once. Geographically, it was spreading across the country. Evidentially, it was dividing into different levels of certainty. Some victims were found and could be connected through circumstances, property, vehicles, or Knowles's statements. Others simply disappeared, leaving investigators with his own account as one of the principal sources of information. And as the number of cases increased, the danger of treating every statement as fact became greater. Knowles's later interest in publicity would make that problem even more complicated. He appeared to understand that the story of a man claiming dozens of murders could attract enormous attention. Yet the people at the center of those claims were not statistics. They were individuals such as Kathy Sue Pierce, whose 3-year-old son survived her death; William Bates, whose body was eventually found in Ohio; Emmett and Lois Johnson, whose lives ended while they were traveling; Charlene Hicks, whose encounter with Knowles began when her motorcycle experienced trouble; and Dawson, whose disappearance left behind an unanswered question. By the end of September, Knowles had moved through multiple states and left behind a trail that investigators would eventually have to reconstruct across thousands of miles. But the journey was not over. October would bring him farther north, where 2 mothers and daughters would become victims, followed only days later by another killing in Virginia. Then, in November, the trail would return to Georgia and approach its final and most violent stage. The manhunt would soon involve not only investigators trying to connect murders, but police officers and civilians drawn directly into Knowles's flight. Before that happened, however, another group of victims would enter the story, and with them the trail would take yet another turn. By the beginning of October 1974, Paul John Knowles had already left a trail through several states. Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, Texas, and Alabama had become connected to a sequence of deaths and disappearances that would later be examined as part of the same investigation. Yet the full picture was still difficult to see. Knowles was constantly moving, and every new location created another local crime scene, another missing person, another family searching for answers. Some cases had physical evidence and recovered bodies. Others depended heavily on what Knowles himself later claimed. The distinction between those two categories would become one of the defining problems of the investigation. On September 23rd, Knowles had met in Dawson in Birmingham, Alabama. The two began traveling together, but around September 29th, Dawson disappeared. Knowles later said that he had killed her and thrown her body into the Mississippi River. Her body was never found. That meant investigators could not independently establish the circumstances of her death from a recovered body or a complete physical record. Dawson therefore remained among the cases associated with Knowles in which the level of confirmation was lower. Her disappearance illustrates the difficult position investigators faced. Knowles' statements could potentially provide information unavailable anywhere else. But those same statements could not automatically be treated as proof. The question was always whether he was describing an actual crime or adding another story to the growing mythology around himself. By October, the trail moved farther north. On October 16, 1974, in Marlborough, Connecticut, two members of the same family became victims. Karen Wine, approximately 35 years old, and her 16-year-old daughter, Dawn Wine. According to the supplied information, both were killed after being restrained and strangled with nylon stockings. Their deaths were particularly significant because they demonstrated that Knowles' violence was not limited to isolated encounters with individual strangers. Two people within the same household could become victims during the same episode. Karen Wine was an adult woman. Dawn was 16. Their ages were different, but the crime brought them together as mother and daughter. Beyond those established facts, the supplied material does not provide additional details about their final hours, their relationship, or the circumstances in which Knowles entered their lives. Those gaps matter. In true crime narratives, there is always a temptation to fill silence with imagined dialogue, emotions, or scenes. But when the evidence does not provide those details, doing so would create a story rather than reconstruct a case. What can be said is that the deaths of Karen and Dawn became another part of the interstate trail attributed to Knowles, extending that trail all the way into Connecticut. Only 3 days later, on October 19th, Knowles was in Woodford, Virginia. The victim there was Doris Hovey, 53. Hovey was shot to death. Once again, the method differed from the strangulations attributed to earlier crimes. Alice Curtis had died after being gagged. Marjorie Howie had been strangled with a nylon stocking. Kathy Sue Pierce had been strangled with a telephone cord. William Bates had been strangled. Emmett and Lois Johnson had been shot. Charlene Hicks had been strangled. Now Doris Hovey had been shot as well. The variation in methods made it difficult to rely on a single behavioral pattern. Knowles' crimes did not present investigators with one consistent method that could immediately tie every murder together. Instead, the connections were broader: movement, circumstances, property, statements, and eventually the accumulation of multiple cases. Geography remained one of the greatest obstacles. In a single month, Knowles could appear in a state far removed from the location of a previous crime. Local law enforcement agencies were faced with crimes occurring within their own jurisdictions, while the person suspected of causing them could already be hundreds or thousands of miles away. This mobility allowed the individual investigations to remain fragmented for longer than they might have been if all the crimes had occurred in one city. The trail also demonstrated how rapidly circumstances could change. Knowles could meet someone and then continue traveling, A person who appeared to be simply another traveler could become part of a homicide investigation. Someone who had encountered him could disappear. A vehicle could change hands. A stolen possession could become a link between two locations. These elements made the reconstruction of his movements increasingly important. By October 19th, however, the pattern was becoming larger and harder to ignore. The cases connected with Knowles included people from different generations and different circumstances. There was no simple explanation based on age, gender, or location. His victims included children, young adults, middle-aged people, and older adults. Some were women, some were men, and some were members of the same family. The diversity of the victims meant that the common factor was not a particular type of person, but the presence of Knowles himself. That fact would become increasingly important as investigators later attempted to determine which deaths could confidently be attributed to him. Yet the most dramatic stage of the case was still ahead. In early November, Knowles returned to Georgia. The movement that had taken him through so many states would eventually bring him into direct conflict with law enforcement. Before that final confrontation, however, two young people would disappear, followed by one of the most disturbing crimes in the entire case. On November 2nd, Edward Hilliard, 23, and Debbie Griffin, 20, were reported missing near the Macon/Milledgeville area of Georgia. The two had been traveling as hitchhikers. Hilliard's body was eventually found in a wooded area. Griffin remained missing for a much longer period, and according to the supplied information, her remains were found in 1975. Both were connected to Knowles, although the level of evidence differed from the cases that had stronger direct confirmation. Their story added another complication to an investigation already dealing with multiple states and missing victims. One victim had been found, while the other remained missing for an extended period. The investigators' task was not merely to determine what had happened, but to determine how confidently Knowles could be placed at the center of each event. Then, on November 6th, the investigation entered one of its most disturbing phases. In Milledgeville, Georgia, Knowles encountered Carswell Carr Sr., 45. According to the supplied account, Carr invited Knowles into his home. There, Knowles killed him and also killed Carr's 15-year-old daughter, Amanda Beth Carr. The Carr killings were among the most shocking crimes associated with Knowles. The supplied information describes the scene as one of the bloodiest that an investigator later recalled seeing. Yet even with such a description, it is important not to turn the crime scene into spectacle. The essential facts are already devastating. A 45-year-old father and his 15-year-old daughter were killed in their home. Their deaths became another major point in the investigation, and the timing was extraordinary. Only 2 days later, Knowles would be sitting in an Atlanta hotel speaking with a woman who had no idea who he was. That woman was Sandy Fox, a British journalist. Fox did not know that the man she was meeting had become connected to multiple killings across the country. According to her recollections, Knowles appeared polite and charming. Their encounter developed into a brief relationship. The contrast was stark. Behind the ordinary appearance of a man talking with a woman in an Atlanta hotel was a fugitive, whose name was already associated with a growing number of deaths. This encounter would later become one of the most widely remembered aspects of the case because Fox was able to describe her experience from the perspective of someone who had interacted with Knowles without initially knowing his identity or his alleged crimes. She later wrote about the experience, contributing to the public image that helped produce the nickname Casanova Killer. But that nickname can obscure the reality of the case if it is treated as something glamorous. There was nothing romantic about the violence surrounding Knowles. The label came from the way he could present himself in relationships and from encounters with women such as Fox, not from any admirable quality. By this point, the trail had become a disturbing contrast between appearance and reality. Knowles could move between victims, vehicles, states, and relationships while presenting different versions of himself to the people around him. Investigators were trying to reconstruct his movements after the fact, while people who encountered him often did not know the danger they were facing. And after the car murders, the case was moving toward its final stage. There would soon be another survivor who escaped from Knowles, followed by the killing of a highway patrol officer and a civilian. Those deaths would transform the investigation from a sprawling series of homicide cases into an immediate interstate manhunt. The final days of Knowles' freedom were approaching, and the next encounter would bring the violence directly against law enforcement itself. By the middle of November 1974, Paul John Knowles had already been connected to a trail of killings and disappearances extending across several states. Yet the investigation was about to enter its final and most violent stage. Until this point, many of the people associated with Knowles had been ordinary civilians who happened to encounter him in homes, on roads, while traveling, or through circumstances that appeared unremarkable at first. Now, the trail would lead directly to a surviving victim, a highway patrol officer, and a civilian who became a hostage. These events would transform the case from a collection of separate investigations into an urgent manhunt. Among the most important developments was the survival of Barbara Mabby Abel. Around the middle of November, Knowles abducted Abel in Florida and took her vehicle. Unlike many of the people whose names had already entered the investigation, Abel survived. On November 15, 1974, she escaped in Fort Pierce, Florida. The importance of her survival went beyond the fact that she had escaped a dangerous situation. A living victim could provide investigators with direct information about Knowles. In a case where so much of the evidence depended on reconstructing movements after the fact, the testimony of someone who had personally encountered him could be especially significant. Abel's escape also demonstrated that not every encounter with Knowles ended in death. His behavior was not predictable enough to allow investigators to reduce every case to a single pattern. Some people disappeared. Some were killed. One very young child survived after his mother was murdered. And now Barbara Mabby Abel had managed to escape. But whatever information her survival could provide would soon be overshadowed by what happened the following day. On November 16th, Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell encountered a vehicle associated with Knowles. Campbell stopped the vehicle. What followed was not a routine traffic encounter. Knowles resisted, overpowered Campbell, and took the trooper's weapon. He then used the patrol vehicle to stop another motorist, James Meyer. Meyer became the second hostage. At this moment, the situation had changed dramatically. Knowles was no longer simply a fugitive trying to avoid arrest. He had directly confronted a law enforcement officer, taken his weapon, and drawn another civilian into the escape. Campbell and Meyer were transported into Georgia. In Pulaski County, Knowles restrained both men to a tree and shot them. Their bodies were later found still restrained. The murders of Campbell and Meyer were among the final confirmed killings attributed to Knowles, and they immediately intensified the search for him. The death of a highway patrol officer meant that law enforcement agencies were now pursuing a fugitive who had demonstrated that he was willing to attack officers directly. The search became an extensive operation. Knowles took a vehicle and fled. At one point, he passed through a police roadblock in Georgia. The pursuit continued until the vehicle eventually crashed. Knowles was injured, but he did not remain at the scene. Instead, he fled into a wooded area. Authorities responded with multiple resources, including police dogs, helicopters, and numerous officers searching the surrounding terrain. During the pursuit, Knowles was shot in the leg. Yet even after being wounded, he managed to evade the immediate search. The image that emerges from the supplied account is not of an elaborate escape plan, but of a fugitive repeatedly taking advantage of changing circumstances. He had already crossed multiple state lines. Now he was injured, on foot, and attempting to avoid a large-scale police search. The search itself represented a reversal of the dynamic that had existed during the previous months. Earlier, Knowles had been the person moving while investigators attempted to follow his trail. Now the entire weight of law enforcement was focused on locating him. But the person who ultimately brought the pursuit to an end was not a police officer. On November 17th, a 27-year-old Vietnam veteran named David T. Clark encountered Knowles in the area. Knowles was injured and carrying a shotgun. Clark confronted him and used his own firearm to control him. He then sought assistance in contacting the authorities. Henry County investigators Paul Robbins and Billy Payne arrived and took Knowles into custody. The man who had escaped from confinement in Florida on July 26th was finally under arrest. The period of flight had lasted less than 4 months, but during those months the trail had crossed an enormous portion of the United States. The arrest also created a new phase of the investigation. For the first time, authorities had direct access to the man they believed was responsible for multiple murders and disappearances. And Knowles did something that made the case even more unusual. He talked. Rather than maintaining complete silence, he began describing numerous killings. He eventually claimed that he had killed 35 people. The number was shocking, but investigators could not simply treat 35 as an established fact. Some of his statements contained information that could be connected to real cases. Others could not be independently confirmed. The difference mattered because Knowles appeared to understand the power of his own story. The supplied information indicates that recordings showed him interested in becoming a public figure, and in the media value of his confessions. That created a difficult investigative problem. A confession can be one of the most powerful forms of evidence when it contains information known only to the perpetrator and can be independently verified. But a suspect who wants attention can also exaggerate, combine real events with false claims, or claim responsibility for crimes that cannot be established. In Knowles's case, investigators had to separate one statement from another. The case of Imogene Sanders became one example of information that eventually proved significant. Knowles had described a young victim under another name, and decades later, in 2011, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified that person as Sanders. That did not establish all of Knowles's claims, but it showed that at least some of the information in his recordings corresponded to a real case. Other claims remained far less certain. The Anderson sisters, Lillian and Mylette, were among those whose disappearance Knowles claimed responsibility for, but their bodies were never found, and investigators later questioned whether he had actually killed them. And Dawson was another case in which Knowles claimed responsibility, saying he had killed her and thrown her body into the Mississippi River, but her body was never recovered. These differences explain why the commonly cited figure of at least 18 reliably linked victims is substantially lower than Knowles's own claim of 35. The number was not simply a matter of arithmetic. Every name required a different level of evidence. Some cases involved recovered bodies. Some involved physical evidence. Some were supported by circumstances surrounding Knowles's movements. Some were strengthened by his own statements. Others remained unresolved. The arrest, therefore, did not provide a simple ending. Instead, it opened another question. Could investigators use Knowles's own words to reconstruct the crimes he had committed? There was another complication. Knowles would not live long enough to answer that question in court. Before any trial could take place, the investigation would end in a completely different way. On December 18, 1974, approximately 1 month after his arrest, Knowles was being transported with Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee and Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent Ronnie Angel. According to the official account described in the supplied material, Knowles told the officers that he would show them where he had discarded the gun taken from Trooper Campbell. During the journey, Knowles used a paper clip to open his handcuffs. He then seized Sheriff Earl Lee's weapon. A struggle followed, and the gun discharged. Agent Ronnie Angel fired 3 shots at Knowles. Knowles was fatally wounded and died in the vehicle. He was 28 years old. His death occurred before any of the allegations against him could be tested in a courtroom. There would be no jury hearing the evidence. No prosecutor would present a complete case against him. No defense attorney would challenge the state's evidence. No judge would issue a sentence. The man who had claimed 35 victims died, carrying the only complete version of his own story. His death therefore ended his ability to confirm, deny, correct, or expand upon the statements he had made. It also left investigators with a complicated legacy. Some victims could be confidently connected to him. Some were linked strongly, but through different forms of evidence. Others remained uncertain. And the number 35 remained a claim rather than an established total. Questions were later raised about the circumstances of Knowles's death, including suggestions that he may have been deliberately killed in retaliation for the murders of Campbell and Meyer. But the official investigation concluded that the shooting was justified self-defense. The supplied information does not establish that Knowles was unlawfully executed, and therefore that allegation cannot be treated as fact. What is certain is that the pursuit that began with his escape on July 26th ended with his death less than 5 months later. The manhunt was over, but the investigation was not. The unanswered questions remained. How many people had Knowles actually killed? Which of his confessions were truthful? Which were exaggerated? And were there victims whose names never became part of the official record? Those questions would remain long after Paul John Knowles was gone. Paul John Knowles was finally in custody, but the arrest did not bring the investigation to a simple conclusion. In many criminal cases, the capture of a suspect allows investigators to begin assembling the evidence needed for a trial. In Knowles's case, something much more complicated happened. The man they had been searching for began talking about the crimes. He described killings, disappearances, and victims. He eventually claimed responsibility for as many as 35 murders. On the surface, this seemed to offer investigators something they desperately needed: a direct account from the person believed to be responsible. But the more Knowles talked, the more difficult the central question became. Which parts of his story were true, and which parts were impossible to verify? That distinction became essential because the investigation contained two very different kinds of information. There were cases supported by circumstances, physical evidence, recovered bodies, stolen property, or other links to Knowles. Then there were cases in which the principal connection came from Knowles's own statements. The difference between those categories prevented investigators from simply accepting his claimed total of 35 victims. Knowles's willingness to speak was unusual. He did not appear determined to keep every detail of his activities secret. Instead, he described numerous killings and became a source of information about cases scattered across different states. Some of his statements contained information that helped identify victims. One of the clearest examples involved Imogene Sanders, the 13-year-old girl who disappeared in Warner Robins, Georgia, on August 1, 1974. In recordings, Knowles had described a young victim under another name. For years, investigators did not know the identity of the person he was talking about. Then, in 2011, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified that victim as Imogene Sanders. The later identification was significant because it demonstrated that at least one portion of Knowles's account corresponded to a real missing child. His statement was not simply an isolated claim. It contained information that eventually connected to an actual case. But that discovery could not automatically validate everything else he had said. The Anderson sisters illustrated the opposite problem. Lillian Anderson, 11, and Mylette Anderson, 7, disappeared in the Jacksonville area on August 1st. Knowles claimed that he had abducted and killed them, yet their bodies were never found. An investigator with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office later expressed doubts about Knowles's claim. Without the recovery of the girls or other evidence establishing their deaths, the confession could not be treated as equivalent to a case supported by physical evidence. This was one of the central difficulties of the investigation. Knowles could provide information, but investigators still had to determine whether that information could be independently supported. His claim regarding Dawson presented a similar problem. Knowles said that he had killed Dawson after the two had traveled together and that he had thrown her body into the Mississippi River. Dawson's body was never recovered. Her case therefore remained among those associated with Knowles, but not established with the same level of certainty as cases involving stronger evidence. The problem became even more significant because Knowles appeared interested in publicity. The supplied information indicates that recordings showed he understood the value of his confessions to the media and wanted attention. That created a reason for investigators to be cautious. A person who wants to tell the world that he is responsible for dozens of murders may have a reason to tell the truth about some crimes. But there may also be a reason to exaggerate. The number 35, therefore, remained a claim made by Knowles, not an official total established through investigation. This distinction is essential. A confession is not automatically a complete historical record simply because it comes from the person suspected of committing the crime. Investigators must still ask whether the details match known facts, whether victims can be identified, whether physical evidence supports the account, and whether the suspect's movements make the claimed crime possible. In Knowles's case, these questions were particularly difficult because he had traveled so extensively. His movements had taken him through Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, Texas, Alabama, Connecticut, Virginia, and back through Georgia and Florida. Every new location potentially created another local investigation. A murder in one state might initially have no apparent connection to a disappearance hundreds or thousands of miles away. Knowles's own statements could therefore become a bridge between otherwise separate cases. But that bridge had to be tested carefully. The investigation also had to account for the different circumstances surrounding individual victims. Alice Curtis was killed in Jacksonville shortly after Knowles escaped custody, and he left in her vehicle. Marjorie Howie was killed in Atlantic Beach, and her television was missing. Kathy Sue Pierce was strangled in her home in Musella, Georgia, while her 3-year-old son was present. William Bates disappeared in Ohio, and his body was later found in a wooded area after his vehicle. Money and credit cards were taken. Emmett and Lois Johnson were killed in Nevada. Charlene Hicks was killed in Texas. Karen and Dawn Wine were killed in Connecticut. Doris Hovey was shot in Virginia. Edward Hilliard and Debbie Griffin disappeared in Georgia, with Hilliard's body later found and Griffin's remains reportedly recovered in 1975. Carswell Carr Sr. and his 15-year-old daughter Amanda were killed in Milledgeville. Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell and James Meyer were taken hostage and killed after Knowles confronted Campbell during a traffic stop. These cases did not all rest on exactly the same type of evidence. Some involved recovered bodies. Some involved missing victims. Some included property or vehicles associated with earlier crimes. Others became connected more strongly through Knowles's statements. That variation explains why modern accounts often describe at least 18 victims as being reliably connected to Knowles, rather than accepting his claim of 35 as fact. The lower number is not an attempt to minimize the possibility that there were additional victims. Instead, it reflects the limits of what could be established. There is another important complication. Knowles died before investigators could complete the process through a criminal trial. On December 18, 1974, he was being transported with Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee and Georgia Bureau of Investigation Agent Ronnie Angel. According to the official account in the supplied material, Knowles said that he would show investigators where he had discarded the firearm taken from Trooper Campbell. During the journey, he used a paper clip to open his handcuffs. He then seized Sheriff Earl Lee's weapon. A struggle followed, and the weapon discharged. Agent Ronnie Angel fired 3 shots at Knowles, killing him. With that moment, the investigation lost its most direct source of information. Knowles could no longer explain his statements, identify additional victims, correct mistakes, or provide details about cases that remained uncertain. He was 28 years old. His death also meant that the allegations against him would never be tested in court. There would be no complete trial record in which prosecutors could present the evidence and defense. Attorneys could challenge it. There would be no jury deciding which murders had been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The distinction between confirmed and unconfirmed cases would therefore remain unusually important. After Knowles's death, questions were also raised about whether he had been deliberately killed in retaliation for the murders of Campbell and Meyer. But the official investigation concluded that the shooting was justified self-defense. The supplied information does not establish that the officers unlawfully executed Knowles, so that allegation remains an unproven theory rather than an established fact. In the end, the investigation left behind a strange contradiction. Knowles had talked more than many suspects would have. His words helped illuminate some cases, including the eventual identification of Imogene Sanders. Yet the same willingness to speak made his statements difficult to evaluate because he also claimed responsibility for crimes that could not be independently confirmed. His own voice became both a potential investigative tool and a source of uncertainty. The number 35 remained attached to his name, but the evidence could not establish that total. The names of at least 18 victims could be linked to him with substantially greater confidence, while other cases remained disputed or unresolved. And behind every number were individual people whose families were left with something much more difficult than statistics: the loss of a loved one, and, in some cases, the absence of a body or a definitive explanation. That is ultimately what made the Knowles investigation so difficult. His death ended the pursuit of the man, but it did not end the questions surrounding the victims. After Paul John Knowles was killed on December 18, 1974, the immediate pursuit was over. But for the families connected to the case, there was no comparable ending. A police search could end, a fugitive could be captured, a suspect could die. None of those events could restore the people who had been lost. And in some cases, there was not even a body to bring home. This is one of the reasons the Knowles case remains difficult to understand through numbers alone. Knowles claimed 35 victims. Investigators could connect him more reliably to at least 18. Between those figures were unresolved cases, disputed confessions, and questions that could never be fully tested in court. The names, however, remain more important than the numbers. Alice Henrietta Curtis was 65 years old when Knowles entered her Jacksonville home on July 26. Immediately after escaping custody, she was restrained and gagged while he searched the house and took property in her vehicle. The gag became fatal, and Curtis died from suffocation. Her death was the first known killing associated with the period of violence that followed Knowles's escape. She was not a symbol or a statistic. She was a woman in her own home whose life ended during an encounter with a fugitive who had entered her space. Only days later, 2 children disappeared. Lillian Anderson was 11 years old. Her sister, Mylette Anderson, was 7. Both disappeared in the Jacksonville area on August 1st. Knowles later claimed that he had abducted and killed them, but their bodies were never found, and investigators later questioned whether he was actually responsible. Their case therefore occupies one of the most uncertain positions in the entire Knowles investigation. The girl's disappearance could not simply be transformed into a confirmed murder because Knowles had claimed it. Their absence itself became part of the tragedy. There was no recovered body, no courtroom testimony from the accused, and ultimately no opportunity to ask Knowles directly whether his statement had been truthful. On the same date, 13-year-old Imogene Sanders disappeared in Warner Robins, Georgia. Her case remained unresolved for decades. Knowles had described a young victim using another name in his recordings, but investigators did not initially know who that person was. In 2011, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation identified the victim as Imogene Sanders. That discovery gave her case a connection to Knowles that had remained hidden for years. It also demonstrated the strange dual nature of his confessions. His words could sometimes preserve information that investigators could not otherwise find, even while other statements remained impossible to verify. Marjorie Howie, 49, was killed in Atlantic Beach, Florida, on August 2nd. She was strangled with a nylon stocking, and her television was missing, The circumstances suggested that theft may have been involved. The case showed how an ordinary possession could become part of a homicide investigation. A missing television was not merely an item taken from a home. It was another detail in a crime scene that investigators had to interpret while attempting to understand what had happened to Howie. On August 23rd, Kathy Sue Pierce, approximately 24, was killed in Musella, Georgia. Knowles strangled her with a telephone cord. Her 3-year-old son was in the house and survived. The presence of the child adds a particularly painful dimension to the case because the crime did not end with the death of one person. A surviving child was left behind after his mother was killed. The available information does not provide enough detail to describe exactly what the child saw or understood, and it would be wrong to invent those details. But the established fact remains: a 3-year-old child was present, and he survived the death of his mother. William Bates was 32 when he disappeared in Lima, Ohio, on September 3rd. He had encountered a red-haired man at a roadside establishment. After Bates disappeared, his vehicle was gone, while the vehicle belonging to Alice Curtis was found abandoned nearby. Bates's body was discovered in October in a wooded area. He had been strangled. His vehicle, money, and credit cards were believed to have been taken. His case, therefore, became part of the physical trail that helped investigators understand how Knowles moved between locations. Emmett Alexander Johnson and Lois Mildred Johnson were an older married couple who were killed near Ely, Nevada, on September 18th. Their deaths differed from several earlier cases because they were shot. Their inclusion in the Knowles investigation reinforced the fact that his victims did not belong to one narrow category. They were an older couple encountered while camping, far from the Florida locations where his trail had begun. 3 days later, in Seguin, Texas, Eben Charlene Hicks, 42, crossed paths with Knowles after experiencing trouble with her motorcycle. According to the supplied information, she was sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body was found beside the road. Hicks's case illustrates another recurring feature of the story. Encounters that could begin under ordinary circumstances could become deadly. She was not described as someone seeking out danger. Her motorcycle had a problem, and she encountered a man who became her killer. And Dawson met Knowles in Birmingham, Alabama, on September 23rd. They began traveling together, but she disappeared around September 29th. Knowles later claimed that he had killed her and thrown her body into the Mississippi River. Dawson's body was never found. Her name therefore remains tied to the case through Knowles' statement. But the available evidence does not establish her death with the same degree of certainty as victims whose bodies or other evidence were recovered. Karen Wine and her 16-year-old daughter, Dawn Wine, were killed in Marlborough, Connecticut. On October 16th, they were reportedly restrained and strangled with nylon stockings. Their death showed that Knowles' violence could affect an entire household. Karen was approximately 35. Dawn was 16. 2 lives within the same family ended during the same episode. 3 days later, Doris Hovey, 53, was shot in Woodford, Virginia. Again, the method differed. Again, the geography changed. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to define by technique alone. On November 2nd, Edward Hilliard, 23, and Debbie Griffin, 20, disappeared near Macon and Milledgeville, Georgia. Hilliard's body was found in a wooded area. Griffin remained missing longer, and her remains were reportedly recovered in 1975. Both were connected to Knowles, though the supplied information notes that the evidence was not identical in strength to every other case. Then came the Carr family. On November 6th, Knowles encountered Carswell Carr Sr., 45, in Milledgeville. Carr invited him into his home. Knowles killed him and also killed Carr's 15-year-old daughter, Amanda Beth Carr. Their deaths were among the most disturbing crimes in the entire sequence. A father and his teenage daughter were killed in the same home, adding another family to the list of people whose lives were permanently changed by Knowles' violence. Less than 2 weeks later, the final 2 victims entered the story. Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell stopped a vehicle associated with Knowles on November 16th. Knowles overpowered the officer and took his weapon. He then stopped James Meyer, another motorist, and took him hostage. Both men were transported into Georgia, where Knowles tied them to a tree and shot them. Their bodies were later found still restrained. Campbell and Meyer were not simply victims caught in the broader trail. Their deaths were the direct consequence of an encounter that began with a traffic stop and ended in murder. The killings also transformed the nature of the manhunt. Law enforcement was now pursuing a fugitive who had demonstrated that he was willing to kill an officer and a civilian in order to escape. The following day, David T. Clark, a 27-year-old Vietnam veteran, encountered Knowles and helped bring the flight to an end by holding him at gunpoint until authorities arrived. Knowles was arrested, but the victims could not be brought back. Their stories remained scattered across police files, missing person investigations, homicide records, and later accounts of the case. Some families had bodies to bury. Others did not. Some received a degree of certainty. Others were left with unanswered questions. And because Knowles died before trial, there was never a single courtroom proceeding in which every case could be examined together. That absence is one of the defining features of the story. There was no final judicial determination covering all of the murders he claimed. Instead, there was an investigative record of different strengths, supported by different kinds of evidence. His own confession could illuminate one case while remaining questionable in another. His claim of 35 victims could never be fully substantiated. The figure of at least 18 victims represents the cases that could be linked to him with substantially greater confidence. But even that number should not erase the uncertainty surrounding individual cases. The most responsible way to remember the victims is therefore not to treat them as pieces of a serial killer statistic. Each name represents a separate life, a separate family, and a separate loss. Knowles became famous because of the number attached to his name and the dramatic circumstances of his flight. But the people he left behind did not experience the case as a legend. They experienced it as absence. For some, that absence came with a body and an explanation. For others, it came with years of uncertainty. And for some, the person who might have provided the final answers died before those questions could ever be asked in court. The arrest of Paul John Knowles on November 17, 1974, created an expectation that had been impossible during the months of his escape. Investigators finally had the man they believed connected the scattered killings. Yet his capture did not immediately solve the case. Instead, it introduced a new problem. Knowles was willing to talk, and the information he provided could potentially help explain crimes that had occurred across several states. But his words could not simply be accepted as a complete record of what had happened. Some statements could be compared with known cases. Some helped identify victims. Others could not be independently confirmed. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in separating evidence from assertion. This distinction is particularly important because Knowles eventually claimed that he had killed 35 people. The figure was dramatic, but it was not the same as a confirmed victim count. Investigators had to examine each claim individually, asking whether there was a missing person who fit the description, whether a body had been recovered, whether the circumstances were consistent with Knowles's movements, and whether physical or circumstantial evidence connected him to the crime. The problem was made more difficult by the fact that Knowles had crossed state lines repeatedly. A local investigator in Florida might have information that seemed unrelated to a case in Ohio. A Georgia investigator might have no immediate reason to connect a disappearance there with a killing in Connecticut. Knowles's own statements could potentially bridge those gaps, but only if they survived independent scrutiny. His confession regarding Imogene Sanders became an important example. Sanders, 13, had disappeared in Warner Robins, Georgia, on August 1, 1974. Knowles had spoken about a young victim under another name. At the time, investigators did not know the identity of the person he was describing. Years later, in 2011,